Chances are, right about now, you're in the middle of the holiday fog. Maybe you're heading out to see family, maybe you're doing some last-minute Christmas shopping, but either way, everything's probably a blur. So I thought maybe for this week we could do a compilation of old pop culture themed videos, keep it light for the holiday season. Actually, I looked back and I realized that a lot of these compilation videos have been kind of dark. Sorry about that. That's my dog. But this one will be fun. If you want to scroll across the bottom and find a specific video that you want to watch, that's cool. You're free to do that. If you want to put this on while you're trying to sleep, have at it. Maybe it'll make wrapping presents go faster. As always, I'll pop in from time to time. I'll check back in on you. So to get started, this first video was back when Game of Thrones was really big, because I was watching that show, and you know how the winners in that world kind of come at random, and they last for a really long time. I wanted to figure out how that would be possible. Like, what kind of planet would have a climate like that? Last night, we saw the ending of one of the most highly praised shows in TV history, Game of Thrones. And it was, well, I'm recording this before it showed, so I don't know. Hopefully they stuck the landing. The dismount was a bit wobbly. But we're not here to talk about the ending. We're not even really here to talk about the show, because let's be honest, there's two types of people that are watching this video right now. There's the people who are all, yes, Game of Thrones, Game of Thrones, Game of Thrones! And the people who are all, ugh, I'm so tired of hearing about this show. I couldn't give a fuck. Which I get. I totally get that. I used to be that guy, and then my wife got me into it, so this is all her fault. But one thing that is interesting about the show, I've always thought was interesting, is the climate of Westeros, the continent where the show takes place on. And for those who don't watch, one of the most impressive things about the show is how richly detailed this world is. They've got this backstory going back hundreds of thousands of years before even the books start. And one of the little quirks about this world that they've created for this show is that the seasons are completely unpredictable. The summers can last for years and they never know when it's going to end, and then winter's going to begin. And at the beginning of this show, they've had a particularly long summer, so there are many people who are preparing for an especially long and brutal winter.
And winter is coming.
Now, obviously, this is a fantasy series. You gotta suspend your disbelief just a little bit, because there are dragons and zombies and giants and magic and all that kind of stuff. But is there a scientifically plausible explanation for these weird seasons? All right, so it should be said right off the bat, I am not like a Game of Thrones expert or anything. I'm more of a casual viewer. I haven't read the books or anything like that. So if I get anything particularly wrong here, feel free to, correct me in the comments. I say that like you guys have ever been shy about correcting me. But I do think this is an interesting topic, because looking at the climate of fictional worlds can kind of give us a better insight into the kind of climates we might see out there on other planets in the universe, and even a little bit of insight on our own climate. All right, so let's just start there. Let's look at our own climate. What causes the seasons that we experience here on Earth? And it basically comes down to three things: the tilt of the Earth, the elliptical orbit, and Milankovitch cycles. The Earth tilts at about 23 degrees, which is the main reason we have these yearly seasons. So at one part of the year, the northern hemisphere is more facing the sun, and then it rotates around the sun, and at that point, the southern hemisphere is more facing the sun. And that's why it's summer in the southern hemisphere in December and January. This is pretty basic stuff. You probably learned it in grade school. As for the elliptical orbit, that actually plays a very small part in our seasons. Our orbit is almost perfectly circular. It's only very slightly elliptical, with the perihelion actually occurring usually when the southern hemisphere is facing the sun. So that's why the southern summers are a little bit warmer than the northern summers. And lastly are the Milankovitch cycles, which are named after Serbian geophysicist and astronomer Milutin Milankovic. I think I got that right. He proposed this back in the 1920s. And these take into account different variations and precessions in the Earth's tilt and orbit over thousands of years, which change the climate over time. For example, the Earth's tilt tends to sort of wobble a little bit over thousands of years, which can lead to various different periods of ice ages. But these changes occur over long, geologic time spans, nothing you would experience in one human lifetime. Of course, the yearly seasons that we experience here on Earth are kind of what defined the year for us back in the day. We actually changed the calendar over and over again so that it matched the seasons. And this kind of makes me wonder, in Game of Thrones, how do they know how long a year is if the seasons last multiple years? I don't have an answer to this. I'm seriously asking. So anyway, with all that in mind, let's jump into what could be causing the long-term and erratic and unpredictable seasons that they see in Game of Thrones. Scenario number one is that the planet is simply in a highly elliptical orbit around a star. And when I say highly elliptical, I mean compared to Earth's nearly circular orbit. So just by a few degrees, if it was like highly elliptical like a comet or something like that, then the temperature changes would be too much to ever support life. But the gist is, yeah, it passes a little bit closer to the sun each year in its orbit. And this would work to create seasons, and if it was especially in a further out orbit on, say, maybe a bigger star with a wider habitable zone, it might create multiple year seasons before it came back around. But again, wouldn't they just experience that as a really long year? The bottom line is, in this scenario, the seasons would come and go in regular intervals, which kind of kills the whole Game of Thrones thing, so ixnay on that one. One of the many things to be thankful for about the moon is the way it has stabilized our orbit, which is one of the hundreds of variables that has made Earth such a paradise that we should pave over and put up a parking lot. It's so important that a large moon is one of those things that we're looking for as we're looking out for planets that might harbor life. We're looking for a planet with a very large stabilizing moon. Planets without a large stabilizing moon would probably see their axis tilt and wobble quite a bit, which would throw their climate into all kinds of disarray. And the world of Game of Thrones does have a moon, but we don't know exactly how large that moon is and how much of an effect it might be having on the stability of its axis. And the mythology in the show says that there used to be a second moon, but it flew too close to the sun and it burst apart and created a whole bunch of dragons. Like you do. Of course, just like the elliptical orbit, these changes would occur regularly and slowly over long periods of time, so this doesn't really fit the bill. Unless, and this is kind of a weird idea, what if there was like an unbalanced mass inside the planet? Like if the core was slightly off-center and maybe it would get stuck in some different thicknesses of mantle or outer core, and then from time to time it kind of gets dislodged and it shifts the center of mass, and then the whole planet kind of tilts a little bit differently in sudden ways. Maybe. But I seriously doubt that's something that would continue for over billions of years for life to form on a planet, because it seems like that would either tear itself apart or eventually stabilize one way or another. So if that kind of planetary configuration was possible, maybe? But I highly doubt that that's possible. Double star systems are a regular trope in sci-fi movies, and they do exist out there in the universe, so figuring out how a planet might orbit around a double star system is an interesting thought experiment. And there are three types of orbits that planets could take around these double stars. A P-type orbit involves a planet orbiting around both stars that sort of spin around really close to each other in the center. S-type orbits involve double stars that spin around each other from a great distance, allowing the planet to spin only around one of the stars. And then there are chaotic systems where the planets kind of weave in and out between the stars. So in order for a P-type orbit to exist over time, either the two stars would have to be really close to each other, or the planet would have to be really far away, far outside any kind of habitable zone. Now there's a million different kinds of variations at play here, but if the stars orbited close enough to each other, I imagine the center of mass would stay the same, so any kind of planet that was circling around it would just experience regular seasons just like any other planet. Now S-type orbits get interesting because theoretically, if the planet was between the two stars, it would be absorbing energy from the other star, basically getting twice as much energy as it's normally getting from the other side of the star, which would heat it up severely on one side and cool it off more on the other side. And since the stars are revolving around each other, the length of the seasons would vary, because by the time the planet gets around to its original position in its orbit, the two stars have moved in relation to each other. But there are two major problems here. The first is just that even if this was the case, it would still be happening on a regular schedule that they could figure out, so. And the other problem is, in order for that planet to have a stable orbit, the other star would have to be so far away that it probably wouldn't be affecting this planet in terms of its climate very much. Now, I suppose there's a situation where it's just perfectly balanced so that it does affect the planet just enough that it wobbles in and out closer and further away, but still inside of its habitable zone. And there's also the scenario that the star that the planet is orbiting around is actually much, much bigger than the other star, and the other star has more of an elliptical orbit and flies in and kind of messes things up when it comes around, but still that would take place over huge timescales, and it would be regular timescales. So, like I said, there's a million variables in this scenario. And the last type of orbit, the chaotic orbit where the planet kind of weaves in and out between the stars, is almost impossibly unlikely, because that's so unstable that the planet would eventually get thrown into one of the stars or just ejected from the solar system altogether. Talk about fire and ice. Anyway, this is a fun scenario to think about, but ultimately it doesn't matter because there's only one sun in the sky on Game of Thrones. Of course, one of those stars could be a brown dwarf that doesn't emit light, so then that wouldn't have an extra star in the sky. But no, all those other problems would still exist, so never mind. Okay, what if the known world of the Game of Thrones is actually on a moon revolving around a large Jupiter-like planet? And this is actually interesting because the orbit around that planet would cause the moon to like fluctuate in and out in that habitable zone, which might cool and warm the planet. And especially if the planet has more of an eccentric orbit, that would introduce all kinds of chaos and randomness in there that would make these kinds of seasons unpredictable. Interesting, but a Jupiter-like planet would dominate the sky, which is not there in Game of Thrones, so... We talked a little bit about the axis of the planet wobbling, but what if it was like a crazy 90-degree tilt like Uranus has? Uranus really is the weirdo of the solar system, and not just because it's named after your exit hole, but because it actually has a 90-degree tilt, which means that twice a year, the poles are what's facing the sun. Living on a planet like that basically means you being day half the year and night half the year, which is obviously not the case in Game of Thrones. Eyeball worlds are the names given to tidally locked planets that orbit around their stars, much the same way that the moon is tidally locked with Earth, and we see the same side of it all the time. We imagine the planets of the TRAPPIST-1 system to look like this. This means that one side of the planet is always hot and one side of the planet is always cold, which means you would definitely have a land of always winter. It also means that one side of the planet is perpetually in the daytime and the other side is always at night, which is not the case on Game of Thrones. Variable stars are stars whose energy and intensity vary over time. These can fluctuate wildly, or they can come and go in regular cycles. Our own sun actually fluctuates about 0.1% every 11 years. And there are two types of variable stars. There's extrinsic stars and intrinsic stars. Extrinsic stars are basically normal stars without that much variation in their actual intensity, but there's stuff passing in front of it like gas clouds so that it actually dims from where we're standing. Intrinsic variable stars actually have their luminosity change in various ways for various reasons. So whether we're talking intrinsic or extrinsic, there's plenty of evidence that stars can vary their output in random and chaotic ways. Obviously, if it's in extreme ways, it would be too extreme for life to form. But there's nothing saying that a star couldn't, vary randomly but mildly enough for life to survive. So this could be a thing. However, this would require the planet to have an almost vertical axis so that it wouldn't tilt and create seasons, and this is possible. Venus's is only like 2 degrees and Mercury's is like 0.03 degrees, so this could be a thing. The last one I'll talk about here is by far the most boring, but probably the most plausible, and that is pure and simple just weird geography. Weather and climate cycles are some of the most difficult things to accurately predict. There's just so many variables involved. Ocean currents, evaporation cycles, feedback loops, the list goes on and on. I mean, here on Earth, we've had random climate fluctuations spring up from just regular natural phenomena, from ice ages that last for thousands of years to ice ages that last for just a few years. So much of our climate is based on ocean currents. In fact, one of the big concerns that they have about Arctic warming is that it might shut down the North Atlantic current. This is the cycle of water that flows around the North Atlantic, basically a giant conveyor belt, bringing warm water up from the Caribbean along the coast of North America, where it cools and sinks, then swings back around down Europe, where it actually increases the temperature there up to 10 degrees Celsius. This is also known as the thermohaline current because it's partly about temperature and it's partly about salt. As the water warms in the southern part of the hemisphere, the water evaporates, and that increases its salinity. And then when it goes up north and it cools, it goes down into these chimneys, into the lower depths of the ocean, and it continues there for a little bit until the salt content kind of equals out, and then it comes back up again. What they're worried about is if too much of that fresh water that's locked away in the Arctic ice melts down into the ocean, it could sort of desalinate those currents, preventing it from sinking down and shutting down the current altogether. This would prevent all that warm water from traveling north and cause some extreme cooling, possibly leading to another ice age. Perhaps the world of Game of Thrones has a particular, ocean geography that shuts down a thermohaline current at regular but unpredictable intervals that leads to long and brutal winters. Yeah, it might just be that simple. Or it might just be magic. Because, magic. Or it could be a combination of any of these things that I talked about. It's all possible. And this isn't uncharted thought territory. There's an actual scientific paper that was released by actual climate scientists on April 1st, 2013, yes, April Fool's Day, where they covered this in depth. It might have been a joke, but they took the subject very seriously and applied their, climate equations to it and everything. There's a link to it down in the description if you want to check it out. It's pretty cool. And by the way, I do think that looking at Game of Thrones through the lens of climate is very appropriate because I've always thought that the show in general is a metaphor for climate change. You know, the whole various powers jockeying to control the world while there's an existential threat looming out there that nobody's paying attention to or taking seriously. You know, it's not even a thinly veiled metaphor, it's right on its sleeve. There's a fantastic scene in season 7 where Jon is upset and frustrated because nobody believes him and nobody's taking seriously the threat of the Night King and the White Walkers and all that. And Tyrion's response, I think, sums things up nicely.
How do I convince people who don't know me that an enemy they don't believe in is coming to kill them all?
Good question.
I know it's a good question. I'm looking for an answer.
People's minds aren't made for problems that large. White Walkers, the Night King, army of the dead. It's almost a relief to confront a comfortable, familiar monster like my sister.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of human nature to focus on small, inconsequential problems when faced with big, giant ones with no simple solutions. The show may be ending, but hopefully this message lives on. We are lucky to live on such a stable planet, but it's not infinitely stable. At some point, we've got to put our petty squabbles aside and face real grown-up existential problems like climate change or any of the other number of, great filters we seem to be putting in front of ourselves. 'Cause it's up to us. There ain't no Arya to save us. All right, with that, I'm going to leave you. Thanks a lot for watching. You guys go out now, have an eye-opening week, and I'll see you on Monday. Love you guys. Take care. I was recently watching the cinematic masterpiece, The Fifth Element, for maybe the 1000th time when something at the end caught my eye. So they stopped the evil planet thing from hitting Earth, and everybody celebrates. The evil planetary entity is now just a big hunk of harmless rock out in space. The world was saved by the power of love. But this time something occurred to me that I'd never realized before. They're still f***ed. Because gravity still exists, right? And now there's this giant moon-shaped thing, like just hovering out there above the atmosphere. That's still a problem. So I decided to fix the ending of The Fifth Element. It's a little different now. All right, so we're going to be talking about the end of a movie, which means spoilers. So if you've been putting off watching this movie for the last 27 years, I mean, let's face it, you're never going to watch this movie, so you might as well watch this video. If you have seen the movie, then you know what happens at the end, but just in case anybody hasn't, let me see if I can just kind of sum it all up in 1 minute or so. In the movie The Fifth Element, there's a bad guy. Not that bad guy, this bad guy. This is a giant evil entity in space that, in this world, returns every 5,000 years to destroy all life on Earth. It doesn't really have a name, they just call it the Great Evil or the Dark Planet, but it does control Gary Oldman's character, Jean-Baptiste Emmanuel Zorg, and in a scene where Zorg gets a call from the Great Evil, his secretary tells him this.
I know, you don't want to be disturbed except if it's Mr. Shadow, and it's Mr. Shadow on the line.
So I'll be calling it either the Great Evil or Mr. Shadow for this video, or the Dark Planet. Anyway, the only way to stop the Great Evil is to combine 4 sacred stones, which represent the 4 elements, earth, air, fire, and water, and a 5th element, which turns out to be a genetically enhanced super being created by an alien race. This is Lilu, played by Mila Jovovich, and she's so important they dressed her in seatbelts to keep her safe. Anyway, the Great Evil has been using Zorg to steal the stones so that there wouldn't be a way to stop it this time. And that's what most of this movie is about. Zorg's trying to steal the stones while Lilu and Corbin Dallas, played by Bruce Willis, are trying to protect it. So at the end of the movie, they get the stones and they take him to this pyramid temple place to destroy the Great Evil, who at this point is flying toward Earth at a tremendous speed. But as the clock ticks down, they have to figure out how to activate the rocks, and even then it still doesn't work until finally Bruce Willis tells her he loves her, and at the last second he kisses her. And she's so disgusted by it, she vomits a gamma ray burst which stops the Great Evil in its tracks. And this is what I was talking about at the beginning of this video. Because the movie treats it like the Earth is saved. Done deal, pop the champagne, get busy in hyperbaric chambers and whatnot. But that's a huge problem. And this is the part of the video where we talk about why. All right, first of all, let's get a sense of what we're dealing with here. So we know how big it is and how far away it is above the surface of the Earth from a couple of lines in the movie.
There's a ball of fire, it's 1,200 miles in diameter, heading straight for Earth.
The planet seems to have stopped at 62 miles from impact.
Funny it's a French director and they use miles instead of kilometers, but anyway. 62 miles, by the way, just happens to be the exact same altitude as the Kármán line, which is considered to be the border of space, about 100 kilometers. I don't know if that was a coincidence or not, but it happens to be like right at the border of space. So right away, you got this giant moon-looking thing literally at the border of space. So that's going to be a problem for some satellites. Now, of course, this is the future, so the satellites might have some technology that allows them to get around the planet up there, but for the sake of not losing my mind, let's just leave out any technology that might solve all the problems in this video, because the satellites are not even scratching the surface of the actual problem here. So this thing has mass, and it's going to fall down towards Earth, but also Earth is going to fall towards it, or at least part of the Earth. To know how much of the Earth is going to fly toward this thing, we need to calculate its mass. So we know its size, we know its shape, but what about its density? Because I mean, if it's lighter than air, no problem. It can just kind of bob on top of the atmosphere like a cork in water. Probably not the case, though. So earlier in the movie, it was glowing red, like it was partially molten, and there were jets of fire or plasma coming out of it. Now, this might be a star-like object, and what we're looking at is a ball of fusing gases, but it's kind of way too small to have enough gravity to sustain fusion. Now, something that small could be, say, a neutron star or like a quark star, but the gravity of something like that would be like crazy extreme. It would have sucked in the ships at the beginning and probably swallowed Earth whole. So I'm gonna go with the molten rock thing, because it looks like molten rock, and then at the end when it kind of freezes, well, it looks like the moon or Mercury or something like that. Which, by the way, in some of the lore around the fifth element, some suspect that the actual moon was a previous great evil that got defeated. So that's actually out there, that's sort of canon. So I'm just gonna go with it. I'm gonna go with it being a moon-like density. Earth's moon has a mean density of about 3,346 kilograms per cubic meter. So to find the mass, we cube the radius of Mr. Shadow, which is 1,931 kilometers, over 2, which comes out to 965.5 kilometers, and then multiply by 4/3 pi to get the volume. We then multiply the volume by the mean density, giving a mass of about 1.26 times 10 to the 22nd kilograms. So that's less than the moon. It's like a small moon, but that's still a lot of rock floating overhead. In fact, it would be the 6th largest moon in the solar system. Just hanging there. The good news is it won't be hanging there for long. The bad news is it won't be hanging there for long. So first thing that would happen is gravity would get weird. So look, we're used to thinking of gravity as the force that pulls us to the ground. That's an oversimplification. Gravity is exerted by every massive object on every other object with mass. And the closer objects are, the greater the attraction, because gravity falls off according to the inverse square law. Specifically, we're talking about the distance between the centers of the object, so Earth's center to the center of Mr. Shadow. You can get that by adding the Earth's radius to Mr. Shadow's radius, and then add 100 for the space between them. Anyway, all this math tells us is that the gravitational force equals 9.081 times 10 to the 22nd newtons. Which probably doesn't mean anything to you, but it's a lot. It's 458 times stronger than that of the moon. And you know, funny thing about the moon, it causes tides. So let's talk about that for a second. Tides happen because the moon's gravity pulls all the ocean water towards it, and the sides facing each other feel the gravity the strongest. So the water around the planet creates a slight bulge. And the reason it seems to rise and fall throughout the day is because the Earth is rotating, so what we see as the tide rising and falling is really just us passing through the Earth's bulge. Insert immature bulge joke here. So yeah, if the moon can do that, what would a tidal force 458 times stronger do? The answer, a lot. So immediately, water from all around the world would pull toward this new moon in the sky, causing massive tsunamis all around the planet, and if it's above Egypt, which it seems to be in this movie, a just biblical flood would swell over Cairo from the Mediterranean and the Red Seas. Below Mr. Shadow, trees and buildings would be ripped out of the ground, any cars and unfortunate people would float off the ground like it was the Rapture, which might be a good thing because it would get you away from all that rushing water. And then there's the atmosphere. All the air would flow toward this object as well, causing hurricane-force winds all around the planet. The air pressure around Egypt would increase, while on the other side of the world, it would get dangerously thin. So people in New Zealand might struggle to breathe and even see the sky turn black as the air rushes away from them. And last but not least, the land would be pulled toward the object as well. The tidal force would cause the plates on the Earth's crust to shift and warp, causing earthquakes all over the planet, setting off volcanoes at the fault lines. So planet-wide hurricane-force winds, floods, volcanoes, earthquakes, and it hasn't even fallen yet. And when it does fall, chances are it won't be all in one piece. So in my video about the hypothetical Earth with rings, I talked about the Roche limit. So the Roche limit is this distance away from Earth, or any large object in space, where if something gets close enough, if it gets past that Roche limit, it'll be torn apart by tidal forces. Again, it has to do with that inverse square law that I was talking about earlier, so that, a large object, like say Mr. Shadow, it would feel the gravity on the closer side a lot stronger than it does on the far side, and that difference in forces eventually causes the rock to break apart. It's kind of like if somebody hands you a piece of paper and you go to grab it and you grab it too fast and the other person doesn't have time to let go, and the pull exceeds the strength of the paper and the paper rips. But same kind of idea. Actually, some of the old in the audience might remember the Shoemaker Levy 9 comet from 1992. It was torn apart when it passed by Jupiter and then eventually plunged into it, and it left a gnarly scar bigger than the Earth. So Mr. Shadow would most likely break apart and fall in sort of a elongated teardrop shape, assuming that it's in a fixed position. In this shot right after they freeze the planet at the end of the movie, you can see it is moving a little bit. It's hard to tell how fast it's moving. I personally doubt that it's anywhere close to orbital velocity, but I suppose one can make the argument that the filmmakers showed it moving to suggest that it was in orbit and it wouldn't just fall down to Earth like we've been talking about. In which case everything would be fine, right? So we're going to consider that option as well. So there's two scenarios. Scenario 1 is if the dark planet is motionless and just hovering above the Earth. Scenario 2 is if it's at orbital velocity just above the Kármán line. Place your bets which will be worse. Here we go. Okay, here's scenario 1. Mr. Shadow gets blasted by Lilu's energy vomit and slows to a stop 100 kilometers above the Earth. It hangs in space for a moment before Earth's gravity starts to pull it down. Immediately, the Earth's oceans begin surging toward Egypt and the Mediterranean, causing massive kilometer-high tsunamis along coastlines, with Earth's rotation making it a little bit worse on east coasts. Of course, the tidal force wouldn't just affect water. Like I said before, Earth's crust would warp and shift as well. There would be catastrophic earthquakes all around the world, not to mention opening up dozens of volcanoes. Imagine like a couple dozen Krakatoas all going off at once. Or even a Yellowstone supervolcano. As the dark planet descends, cracks form along its surface as the bottom of the planet's pulled harder than the top, causing it to elongate and break apart. On the ground below, Lilu and Corbin might notice a lightness as the center of Earth's gravity moves towards the falling moon. And as it continues to fall, the Earth's gravity will continue to weaken until objects and people themselves begin to float. So inside the temple, Corbin and Lilu lift off the ground, scrambling to maintain control as they fly faster and faster into the ceiling, which I'm assuming has a hole at the top? Because that's how the beam came out, right? Let's assume there's a hole at the top. From this hole, they'd be able to stop themselves and watch as the dark planet breaks apart into a cluster of fragments, some large, some small, just raining down towards Earth for the next 2.5 minutes. It's then that they notice that off in the distance, a wall of water headed their way. It might look like a dust storm at first, but the distant roar sound getting louder and louder would give it away. And right about the time that they're able to rationalize that threat, they get distracted by the sound of like cannon fire off in the distance. And they look around trying to figure out where it's coming from, like maybe somebody's shooting at the planet for some reason. What they're actually hearing are sonic booms as fragments of the planet come raining down in the atmosphere at supersonic speed. And it's only now that they can look up and see individual pieces of the planet getting closer and closer and closer until... Well, exactly how bad would these impacts be? Well, if we look at the Chicxulub impact that wiped out all the dinosaurs, that impactor was thought to be around 80 kilometers in diameter. Mr. Shadow is 23 times larger than that. And as it broke apart, it would be like dozens of Chicxulub impacts happening at the same time. Now granted, the Chicxulub asteroid was traveling at around 20,000 meters per second. That releases a lot of kinetic energy. The Mr. Shadow remnants would probably only reach about 1,400 meters per second tops. But still, the sheer amount of mass falling to the ground would release 2 orders of magnitude more energy than the impact that, wiped out almost all life on the planet. Yeah. Lilu and Corbin ain't gonna make it, y'all. Literally everything in a 2-kilometer radius would be buried under the debris, and the impact would kick up enough dust and debris to cover the planet for hundreds of years. All this dust and debris would combine with the clouds of ash from the dozens of volcano eruptions going around that would trigger powerful lightning storms all over the planet. It would look like planet Earth was shorting out or something. The energy released from this impact would basically vaporize everything within thousands of miles from the impact, and it would basically set fire to that entire hemisphere. A hemisphere, by the way, that contains about 75% of the Earth's population. So yeah, that's pretty much gone immediately. By the way, in the movie, the president says what the population of the planet is in a line to the priest.
We're going to protect the life of some 200 billion of my fellow citizens.
So 75% of that is 150 billion people dead. That is a lot of people. Can that even be right? 200 billion people? Is that possible? That's like more than all the people that have ever lived in all of history. It's like 8 billion now. Hold on a second. Okay, looking at a population growth chart over the last 50 years, it's going up to 2021. So it was 3.77 billion in 1971, 7.9 billion. So that's 4.13 billion growth over the last 50 years. So if you just added 4.3 every 50 years to go forward to where the Fifth Element takes place, which is in 2263, that's the year that this takes place. So that would be about 22 billion. So that's just adding at the same rate as what we've been experiencing over the last 50 years. But you could also look at it logarithmically. So the growth from 1971 to 2021 was 209%. So if you applied 209% sort of cumulatively over the next, whatever, 200 years or whatever, it would go, let's see, so it'd be starting at 7.9 in 2021, it'd be 16.5 in 2071, 34.5 in 2121, 72.2 in 2171, and then 151 billion in 2221. And it would basically come out to about 316 in 2271. Wow. If you look at it logarithmically, that's actually not an inaccurate projection. I don't think it'll ever get that large, though. I think population is going to taper off a bit over time. It's more of an S-curve kind of thing. At least that's what I've read. It won't, however, taper off nearly as fast as it would at the end of the Fifth Element if that happened. I think it's safe to say this would be an extinction-level event. On Earth, anyway. Thankfully, there are places like Blossom Paradise where people can survive off of Earth, but Earth is totally screwed at the end of the Fifth Element. So that's scenario one. But then there's that second scenario where Mr. Shadow goes into orbit, which obviously would be safer because it would stay in space and not fall to the ground, right? Right? Okay, remember how I was talking about how the gravity of this object would affect the tides and pull on the tectonic plates and set off earthquakes and volcanoes and all that? Yeah. Imagine that flying all the way around the Earth every 90 minutes. So not only would that create, like, biblical tidal waves and flooding and set off volcanoes all around the world, it would eventually cause so much heat from friction, it would literally evaporate the oceans and melt the Earth's surface. Of course, the Roche limit rule still applies, so the dark planet would do the teardrop thing and break apart, and since there is still some atmosphere at 100 kilometers, it will slow these pieces down, causing them to rain down on the planet, burning up through the atmosphere, possibly creating enough heat to just set the atmosphere on fire. There would be multiple, maybe dozens, of Chicxulub-sized pieces crashing down all over the world at almost Chicxulub velocity. So yeah, just one Chicxulub after another as these things enter the atmosphere. Now eventually the pieces of debris that were high enough to not get pulled in by the atmosphere would probably form a nice little ring, which I'm sure would be nice to look at. Of course, the ground below it would be a charred out husk covered with thick clouds of smoke, ash, and water vapor. Earth would basically look like Venus, but with rings. Yeah, even the roaches and tardigrades would be checking out at that point. Yeah, unfortunately, pretty much any way you slice it, the end of the Fifth Element is a massive disaster. Like, just everything's over on Earth. Even love. Mr. Shadow won. Zorg won. I mean, he's dead, but he still won. I guess if there's a moral to the story, it's, that I overthink things. Kind of a lot. I spent time on this. But that's it for today. You guys go out there, have an eye-opening rest of the week. Stay safe, and I'll see you next Monday. Love you guys. Take care. That was a video that nobody asked for about a 25-year-old movie that nobody thinks about anymore, but I couldn't help myself. I got curious and I had to nerd out on it. Does that sound like you? Do you just get curious about things and just have to like jump headfirst into the rabbit hole? Do you like to crunch those numbers and do that math and find answers to burning questions? Then that, my friend, is your superpower. And you can supercharge that superpower with a few minutes a day on Brilliant.org. Brilliant is an online learning site and mobile app that does something unique. It works. Instead of just asking you to brute force memorize facts and figures, Brilliant teaches by having you solve problems through interactive puzzles and games, basically hacking your natural problem-solving ability and using it to your advantage. Yeah, you know all those little mobile games that hack your reward centers to get you addicted so they can pelt you with ads? Well, Brilliant does the same thing, except you're actually learning valuable concepts and skills with no ads. And when you learn by solving problems, the lessons stick, because you learned it in a way that makes the most sense to you. Like, take their math catalog. You can start as simple as you're comfortable and work your way up all the way to advanced college-level calculus. As somebody who struggled with math in school, I've got to say, it's been really cool to like go back through some of these brilliant courses and actually feel like, you know, I understand this stuff that I never could quite grasp back then. It really does work, so if you want to give it a try yourself, just go to brilliant.org/answerswithjoe, or just scan the QR code here on screen, and you can get 20% off the annual subscription, which gives you an unlimited daily access to everything on Brilliant. I'm talking computer science, physics, LLMs, data analytics, all the stuff you need to become a big brain supervillain. Also, there's probably someone you forgot to get a gift for. If they're a nerd, your problem has been solved. You're welcome. Anyway, go check out Brilliant, the link's down below. Now, let's talk about whether or not Thanos was right. Some people actually think he was. Hey! Happy Earth Overshoot Day! Okay, I'm a little bit behind, but Earth Overshoot Day is the day every year when the consumption of natural resources by humans on Earth overshoots the amount of natural resources the Earth produces. It's basically the day each year that we max out our credit card. And this year it happened on August 1st. And it's been inexorably creeping up every year. We do live on a finite planet with a finite amount of natural resources, and the population on this planet continues to grow up. Not just grow, but also become more developed. If everybody on the planet consumed at the same rate as the average American, we would need 5 planets to sustain us. And this is a problem, because all the other places that we can move to nearby are not great. And this was actually addressed in the biggest blockbuster movie of the year this year, Avengers: Infinity War. Now, without getting too spoilery, the big bad guy in this movie is a guy named Thanos, a purple people beater who believes that the only way to save all life in the universe because of overpopulation and overconsumption is to get rid of half of it. Now, this was clearly evil. But was he right? Now let's just set aside for the purposes of this video the fact that the Infinity Stones that gave Thanos the ability to wipe out half of all life in the universe also could have created more resources, or created another universe for people to move into, or just made half of all life in the universe infertile. Any of those would have solved the problem without murdering a bunch of people. There were options, Thanos. But did he need to do anything at all? Was his reasoning sound at least? Well, let's look at the facts. For tens of thousands of years, the human population remained pretty much unchanged, totally stable. And then around the time of the Industrial Revolution, an explosion occurred that's continuing to this day. It took tens of thousands of years for the population to hit 1 billion in 1804, and then another 123 years to get to 2 billion in 1927. Only 33 years to reach 3 billion in 1960, and then another billion by 1974, another billion by 1987, and another billion by 1999. As of this recording, the population is 7.6 billion. It grows by 83 million every year, 200,000 every day. 318 from the time you started watching this video. If this trend continues, we'll hit 10 billion by 2050. By the end of the century, 15 billion. Hearing any alarm bells yet? The first person to sound the alarm on overpopulation was the English cleric Thomas Malthus, who wrote the book An Essay on the Principle of Population in 1798. In the book, he wrote that as food production increases, people use this prosperity not to improve their quality of life, but to reproduce. This leads to overpopulation and overconsumption, and eventually to starvation and suffering, especially amongst people in the lower classes. This became known as a Malthusian trap. In extreme examples, this can lead to war and famine and cause unimaginable suffering, known as a Malthusian catastrophe. But luckily for the world, according to Malthus anyway, we have war and famine and pestilence and disease, these things that help prevent an even worse disaster further down the line. These are all good things as far as he's concerned. I bet he was a real hit at parties. Cheery though he might have been, his ideas were very influential and popular and stuck around long enough till the 1960s for Paul Ehrlich to come along. He's a biologist from Stanford University and wrote the book The Population Bomb, which became a bestseller. At this point, the population explosion was in full-on exploding mode, and there was a lot of anxiety out there, especially amongst economists and sociologists, about how the human race was going to cope with such an overpopulation problem. And he suggested that the 70s and 80s were going to be periods of huge suffering and famine. Pretty alarmist tone, and his prediction about the 70s and the 80s were fairly off the mark, but he was one of the first people that tied the well-being of the planet to the number of people on it, a problem that's going to continue to grow over time. And all that makes sense, but is it true? I mean, let's look at the numbers. Poverty rates have actually gone down as the population has grown. Prosperity has increased. Global food production has gone up. Education rates have risen. Even IQs have increased over time due to better nutrition and more education. In fact, here we are, we got more people on the planet, far more than ever before in world history, And not only is starvation not a problem, but obesity is becoming a worldwide epidemic and getting worse every single year. Today, more people die from obesity than starvation. Clearly the assumption mo people, mo problems is not quite true. Yes, we've been using more arable land for farmland to feed everybody than ever before, and often this comes at the expense of forests, which do take CO2 out of the atmosphere. This is a problem. But advancements in farm technology, including GMOs, as controversial as they are, has multiplied the output of the farmland that we're using. Thanks to technology and human ingenuity, the world's resources seem to be able to support a lot more people than we thought it could. In fact, there's something of a paradox here, in that more people there are out there, especially more educated people, the more minds there are working on solutions to maximize our resources and making more available to all. With the onset of technology, resources, and especially economies, cease to be a zero-sum game. This at least was the opinion of economist Julian Simon, who challenged some of Paul Ehrlich's assumptions in The Population Bomb, which resulted in a very famous bet. He challenged Paul Ehrlich to pick 5 commodities, any 5 that he wanted, over any period of time longer than a year. And he bet that over that time, the value of those commodities would actually go down instead of up. Ehrlich took him up on the challenge, and he and his team picked copper, nickel, chromium, tin, and tungsten, and chose a period of 10 years. The wager began in 1980, and 10 years later in 1990, the results were in. And every single one of the commodities that he picked had gone down in price, even though the population had gone up by 800 million people, the largest jump in any decade in human history. Now this is all interesting, but 10 years is a very short amount of time. Eventually, if the population continues to rise exponentially, we're gonna reach a breaking point, which is why, luckily, we aren't gonna grow exponentially. Those projections I mentioned earlier, I kind of just made them up. I didn't totally pull them out of my butt. I projected those based off of the current rate of growth, but the current rate of growth is falling. Here's the deal, pre-industrial revolution, it was actually quite common to have a whole litter of kids because you could expect at least one of them to be, eaten by bears, or fall off a horse, or get smallpox, or get swept away by a river, or just get a cut and die of a random infection. Seriously, time travel sounds cool, but I refuse to go back beyond the age of antibiotics. That just sounds like a nightmare. So anyway, the birth rate was high, but the death rate was high too, so the population, remained stable. Then around the time of the Industrial Revolution, mass production made better things available to more people, the jobs got a little bit better in many cases, and we started to wrap our heads around, medicine and figuring out how to treat people. Childhood mortality went down. So now you've got a really high birth rate and a lower death rate. So population went up. But eventually the birth rate adjusted. Couples realized they didn't have to produce an entire soccer team worth of kids in order to continue their family, so the birth rates went down and the population stabilized. This has happened in developed countries all around the world. A big population boom is just part of the transition from third world to first world. Today there are still some countries going through this transition, so the population is continuing to increase, but as these countries stabilize, so will their birth rates, and the population will even out. So what we're looking at here isn't so much an exponential explosion as it is an S-curve that's gonna, level out over the next 100 years or so. According to the UN, it'll level out somewhere below 12 billion people. But that's still a lot of people. Can the Earth support 12 billion people? The very short answer is yes, but not at our current consumption levels. One of the strongest arguments for veganism is the amount of land that's required to feed the livestock that we eventually eat ourselves. It's incredibly wasteful. Humans over the next couple hundred years are gonna have to become a lot more vegan and a lot more efficient in the use of our resources. The good news is that more people that are thinking about this kind of thing, the more brilliant ideas that are gonna come out that are gonna make this sort of diet a lot more palatable, so that people 2 centuries from now won't just be eating birdseed. A vegan diet doesn't have to be awful. Have you ever tried an Impossible Burger? So we find ourselves at something of a paradox. The best way to reduce our consumption of resources is to reduce the population, and the best way to reduce the population is to spend and invest a lot of resources into developing countries. By the way, the biggest reason Thanos' plan was dumb was because it wouldn't work. After a while, the universe would just repopulate itself right back to where it was in the first place. The bubonic plague in the 1300s is perhaps the only instance in human history where the population actually went down. But let's take a look at what happened afterward. The rate of growth more than doubled. So Thanos' plan would create all that pain and suffering for nothing, because we'd wind up right back where we started. Now this is a weirdly, hotly contested issue. There's a lot of people out there that think Thanos did nothing wrong. But what do you think? Do you agree? Talk about it in the comments. Thanks again for watching, everyone. You guys now go out, have an eye-opening week, and I'll see you next Monday. Love you guys, take care. This is Salem, Massachusetts. which famously got caught up in a witch craze in 1692 that led to the executions of 19 people. It was a society gone mad, overcome by fear and suspicion. And it's not the last time this happened. In fact, 200 years later, in 1892, you get the story of Mercy Brown. Mercy Brown was the unassuming daughter of George Brown, a Rhode Island farmer whose life had just been through a series of tragedies. Tuberculosis had been ravaging the area, they called it consumption at the time, and in this outbreak, George lost his wife Mary, his daughter Mary Olive Brown, and in the same year, Mercy Brown herself died of the illness. And even as he was burying Mercy, his son Edwin became sick. But if Mercy's life had been unassuming, her death would be nothing of the sort. Because 2 months later, a mob of people from the nearby town of Exeter dug up Mercy's body, pulled out her heart, and set it on fire. Mercy unfortunately got caught up in another Salem witch trial-like event that took place in New England in the late 1800s. Only this time they didn't think that Mercy was a witch. They thought she was a vampire. So just to put this time period into perspective, this was the 1890s. This was the Gilded Age. We had light bulbs and telephones, transatlantic steamships. Mercedes had its first car on the road at this point. We even had the germ theory of medicine, though it was still in its early days and hadn't been universally adopted in some rural areas. The old folk remedies and superstitions held sway. And rural New England was one of those places. By the way, Mercy Brown was not an isolated event. Another story involves Rachel Harris of Manchester, Vermont. This was about 100 years earlier in 1790, but Rachel died of tuberculosis. Her husband then married her stepsister, Hilda, who also started to show signs of TB. And the local townspeople thought that it was Rachel's fault, that she was escaping her grave at night and enacting revenge on her stepsister. So they exhumed Rachel's corpse in February of 1793. They removed her heart, liver, and lungs and burned them on a blacksmith's forge. This was a big event, by the way. Like 500 people showed up to take part in this. Although, I don't know, in fairness, there probably wasn't a whole lot to do in 1793 Vermont. Regardless, despite their valiant efforts, it didn't stop Hulda from dying in September of that year. So this was a real thing. People were convinced that vampires existed and were preying on the living. But these weren't exactly the vampires that we think of today. Today we've seen vampires in any conceivable way possible, from Count Dracula to Edward Cullen from Twilight to Grandpa Munster. But all vampires in fiction have a few core characteristics in common. They drink human blood, they can turn their victims into vampires, they prey on their victims at night because the sun kills them, they have hypnotic powers, and they can't see their images in mirrors and have no shadows. Of course, a lot of what we think of now as a vampire was kind of popularized first by Bram Stoker, who wrote Dracula in 1897. He was the first person to take all of these sort of folk stories about vampires and sort of codify them in a way. It's thought that he named the character Dracula after Vlad III, who ruled an area of modern-day Romania called Wallachia from 1456 to 1462. His father was Vlad II, who went by Vlad Dracul, meaning Vlad the Dragon, so Vlad III was called Dracula. He was also called Vlad the Impaler because he got a kick out of, impaling his enemies on wooden stakes. It was also said that he enjoyed dining amongst his dying victims and would dip his bread in their blood, which is horrifying and really unsanitary. Another historical figure that may have inspired Bram Stoker is a Hungarian countess named Elizabeth Bathory. If you've never heard of Elizabeth Bathory, it's probably because she killed everyone who met her. It's rumored that she tortured and murdered more than 600 young women during the 16th and 17th centuries, and she would even bathe in the victim's blood. Again, guys, pathogens, jeez. It should be noted that these accusations may have been politically motivated and completely untrue, but they did feed into beliefs that people already had about monsters drinking the blood of others. So these stories go all the way back to the Middle Ages as plagues began to spread throughout Europe. People didn't know what was going on. They often turned to folk tales and supernatural stuff to explain it. Like, for example, some of the victims of the plague had mouth lesions that bled, and some thought that their mouths were bloody because they'd been, drinking other people's blood. The point is, there are a few diseases that historians think are related to vampire stories. The first one is rabies. In 1998, neurologist Juan Gomez Alonso published a paper in Neurology that argued that the symptoms of rabies might explain vampire myths. Rabies lyssavirus causes rabies in animals. It's transmitted through direct contact with saliva or brain nervous tissue from an infected animal. And rabies affects the central nervous system. Once it reaches the brain, it can cause things like agitation, anxiety, confusion, hallucinations even, before eventually killing the victim. Have you ever actually looked into rabies? Rabies sucks. And people with rabies go rabid. They bite and scratch and claw at people like a wild animal. Seeing a person do that might put some ideas in your head. The article also mentions that people who die from rabies often die from suffocation or cardiorespiratory arrest. This apparently can make the blood less likely to coagulate and hinder the composition, which might lead some people to think that the dead person is looking more undead than dead. He also pointed out some correlations in rabies outbreaks and the birth of vampire tales in the 1720s in Eastern Europe. In fact, one physician in 1733 got closer than he thought when he described vampires as, quote, a contagious illness more or less the same nature as that which comes from the bite of a rabid dog. But another contender is porphyria. So rabies may explain the biting and scratching parts of vampire lore, but other characteristics could be explained by a blood condition called porphyria. For people with porphyria, their bodies have trouble making heme, which is an essential part of hemoglobin. That's what carries oxygen around in our blood. And there are two broad types of porphyria. There's acute porphyria, which affect the nervous system, and cutaneous porphyrias that affect the skin. The most common type of acute porphyria is acute intermittent porphyria, which causes sudden and painful attacks. These attacks may include seizures, breathing problems, and red or brown urine, which one might expect one's urine to look like if you were drinking a lot of blood. And these attacks are often set off by triggers including stress, medications, and sunlight. Now, similarly, the skin porphyria is also set off by sunlight. It can cause blisters and excessive hair growth. Porphyria cutanea tarda, or PET, is the most common form of cutaneous porphyrias. It's characterized by extreme sensitivity to sunlight. If exposed to sunlight, people with PET might experience, again, skin blisters, excessive hair growth, or red or brown urine. So they're burned by sunlight, they only come out at night, and they have red pee. Like they've guzzled so much blood that they're just peeing red. And to tack on top of that, one of the treatments for porphyria was to drink animal blood. And people have even speculated that repeated porphyria attacks may cause facial disfigurement and gums to recede, kind of leading to the teeth having a fanged look. Oh, and believe it or not, garlic has a high sulfur content, and that can make it a potential trigger for a porphyria attack. So yeah, there's a lot of interesting connections there, and I definitely could see people mistaking that disease for vampirism, but I don't think that that's where it all came from. Yeah, porphyria is a very rare disease, so I find it kind of unlikely that all the vampire myths came from the very few people walking around with that, but I could totally see how somebody back then might have had their belief reinforced by seeing somebody that has porphyria. But the disease that's most associated with vampires is tuberculosis. Yeah, TB is especially associated with the New England vampire beliefs in the 18th and 19th centuries. A bacteria called Mycobacterium tuberculosis causes TB, which destroys lung tissue and can be fatal if not treated properly. People who experience untreated TB lose weight, become weak, have fevers, and can cough up blood. It basically makes a person look like their blood is being slowly drained out of their bodies, like they wake up every morning a little bit paler than the day before, like something is taking it from them in the middle of the night. TB can also be spread from person to person through the air. It's airborne, but most people back then didn't understand how that worked. So it's no wonder that they might have thought that a supernatural creature was sucking the life out of those dying from TB. And usually that creature was somebody who had recently died. While we're at it real quick, there are a few other supernatural myths that we may have a disease to thank for that. Like werewolves may have been inspired by rabies for all the reasons I listed before. There's also a condition called lycanthropy that makes people hallucinate that they're four-legged animals. There's also hypertrichosis, which in some cases causes hair to grow all over a person's body, giving them a sort of a teen wolf flavor. Witches are sometimes associated with ergot poisoning, which is a wheat fungus that can cause manic episodes and hallucinations. But in the case of the vampire craze of the 18th and 19th centuries in New England, it was tuberculosis. It was totally tuberculosis. A disease that so appears to consume the body that they actually called it consumption. It's easy to see why someone might expect that something else is consuming the body. Maybe somebody who just died. Someone like Mercy Brown. As tuberculosis ravaged nearby Exeter, the townspeople began to suspect things, maybe out of desperation. They just started looking for patterns. And while everybody had suffered during this outbreak, maybe none more so than George Brown, who had lost his wife, his 2 daughters, and now his only son was sick. I can only imagine that by the time these townspeople showed up with their shovels, intent on digging up his family, George was just too exhausted to say no. They dug up his wife Mary and his older daughter Mary Olive, but they had deteriorated to the point that they decided that it couldn't possibly be them. But Mercy, who had only been in the ground for 2 months, in the winter no less, looked remarkably fresh. In fact, her hair and nails seemed to have grown a little bit and blood still pooled in her body. So they did the thing that the folk tales said to do. They took out her heart, burned it, and then mixed the ashes into a potion for Edwin to drink. This would hopefully cure him of the vampire curse. It didn't. He died a few months later. The Mercy Brown story did make some headlines though, and in fact, clippings of these stories and these articles were found in Bram Stoker's files after he died, so he did know about it. may have even been inspired by it. The vampire panic started to die down in the early 20th century when, medical knowledge improved and tuberculosis became treatable with antibiotics. In fact, Mercy Brown is thought to be the very last confirmed vampire in America. Today, her gravesite is a tourist attraction. Visitors to the grave may leave gifts behind like jewelry and flowers. Or in one case, a note that simply read, "You go, girl." All right, gang, that's it for now. You guys go out there, have an eye-opening rest of the week. Please stay safe, and I will see you next Monday. Love you guys. Take care. Anybody want to guess what my lowest viewed video of the whole year was? It was the trailer to my feature documentary that just came out on Nebula. So I'm going to play it again. We live on an ancient planet that's constantly remaking itself. What if instead of talking about it, I actually went to the places that best illustrated it? What if I traveled to the oldest and newest places on planet Earth? Woo! There's a trail that goes right through here, but it's a 6-mile hike and it's an unmarked trail. Oh, this whole thing is like a tube. From there, we'd have to go off trail for at least 1.5 miles or so.
So, technically speaking, illegal.
We're getting you guides through time. I'm kind of having trouble even processing that sometimes.
These are the oldest rocks we know of on maybe our planet. It's a 4 billion-year-old rock, a 3.7 billion-year-old rock, a 3.9 billion-year-old rock. Maybe this is a protocontinent.
Protocontinent. I have to sit with that one for a minute. That's wild.
The landscape here is changing so quickly, so if I'm on a field shift, nobody will ever look at this exact same landscape and see it.
Hawaii is ephemeral.
What does 4 billion years actually mean? That's really hard to comprehend. You think more deeply about things other than rocks when you're sitting on these rocks.
The oldest set of place names had to do with where the larger animals would dwell.
You're talking about like mammoths and mastodons?
Well, we just call them large animals.
It's our planet. This is how everything starts. So that film is out. After 4 years of working on it, that film is finally out. It'll be streaming exclusively on Nebula for a while. I will eventually share it here on YouTube, but for now, it's a Nebula thing. I'll put the link down below. In the meantime, I'll share some clips here and there on social media. I'm really proud of it. We had some really great people working on it that just totally elevated it beyond what I thought it could be. So I hope you get a chance to see it. I mean, I made a movie. It's what it is. It's a movie. You know what's also a movie? Nightmare on Elm Street. Did you know it was based on a real thing? Artists find inspiration from all kinds of places. When Steven Spielberg was a kid and his parents got divorced, he created an imaginary friend to help deal with that situation. That imaginary friend was later the inspiration for E.T. And remember that movie The Cable Guy starring Jim Carrey? Cable Guy! The writer of that movie was a guy named Lou Holtz Jr., and he said that he was inspired to write it after just visiting his mother's apartment late at night, and he saw a cable guy in the hallway, and it just made him think, why is this guy here so late? And the story just came to him. And Wes Craven, the creator of Nightmare on Elm Street, was inspired by a series of articles he read in the Los Angeles newspapers in the early 80s. Stories of otherwise healthy, relatively young people just mysteriously dying in their sleep. Dozens of these cases kept popping up, and nobody knew why. The rumors around all these deaths were that these people were having similar nightmares involving a demon, and it was the demon that was killing them. That was obviously gossip and hearsay, but it did put an idea in his head. That of the ultimate horror villain, somebody that attacks you when you're most vulnerable, when you're asleep. This was the inspiration for Freddy Krueger. The movie was a hit and a cultural icon was born. But what was actually happening to these people? I took a deep dive into the articles and the research around this and found a story that's every bit as wild as any horror movie. It involves deep-seated cultural belief systems, geopolitical maneuvering, and war crimes. Lots of war crimes. This is the story of how Vietnam led to Elm Street. 1984 was a pretty wild year. Gandhi was assassinated, the first cases of the AIDS epidemic appeared, Apple launched its first Macintosh computer, and of course, Nightmare on Elm Street was released in theaters. November 9th, 1984 to be exact. meaning they released it after Halloween, which kind of feels like a missed opportunity. So if anybody's wondering why I didn't release this video before Halloween, I'm just being on brand. It showed in 380 theaters worldwide, but grossed a cool $25 million, which was enough to spawn a franchise and make Wes Craven a staple of the horror genre. By the way, fun fact, even though Elm Street is referenced in the title, it's never actually said in the movie. And the reason he went with Elm Street is actually a lot more interesting than you might think. In 2014, Rolling Stone did an interview with Wes Craven, Robert Englund, and actress Heather Langenkamp for the 30th anniversary, and Robert Englund quoted that line from the movie that, quote, "Every town has an Elm Street."
Every town has an Elm Street.
That's apparently what everybody asks him to write when he signs autographs and stuff, but Wes Craven corrected him, saying this, quote, "Elm Street is the name of the street that ran past the book depository where Kennedy was shot. To me, it was where the innocent world ended." And ironically, it was Kennedy's death that may have put into motion the events that led to the creation of Freddy Krueger in the first place. Confused yet? Well, let's start by looking at those newspaper articles. In an interview with Cinema Fantastique in 2008, Wes Craven explained his inspiration as, quote, "It was a series of articles in the LA Times, 3 small articles about men from Southeast Asia who were from immigrant families and who had died in the middle of nightmares. And the paper never correlated them, never said, hey, we've had another story like this." These were articles that he caught in the late 70s, but by early 1981, those newspapers started to actually see that connection. Stories circulated in Los Angeles, New York, Portland, and Minneapolis told of dozens of men from Laotian communities dying in their sleep. All men, all fairly young and healthy, all of them completely unexplained. The men were from a specific ethnic group from Laos called the Hmong people. In the late 70s and in 1980, waves of Hmong refugees immigrated to the United States, escaping the violence of the Civil War in their homeland. They settled mostly in California and in the Great Lakes region like Minnesota and Michigan. Their culture was deeply superstitious. They were often poor, lived in isolated mountain communities with little formal education, so belief in supernatural entities, demons, and the like wasn't uncommon. So when people began experiencing debilitating nightmares and then men started dying in their sleep with no rational explanation, yeah, rumors began to spread of demonic forces haunting their dreams and taking them at their most vulnerable. It's easy to see how Wes Craven would have been inspired by this. Researchers scrambled for an answer to this, some kind of commonality between them, which was hard. These cases were happening all over the place. And yes, they were all Hmong people, but Hmong people have been around for hundreds of years. This wasn't a known thing that happened. And without a known cause, they came up with a name for the condition, SUNS, which stands for Sudden Unexplained Nocturnal Death Syndrome. I'm sorry, I've got to do it.
Coming this Sunday to the Poughkeepsie Civic Center, Tokamak and Stellarator featuring Nocturnal Death Syndrome.
Bring the kids. You can think of it like SIDS, Sudden Infant Death Syndrome, but for adults. The victims showed no signs of heart attack or stroke, no shared pre-existing conditions. They just died. The wives of some of the victims would say that they would experience labored breathing in the middle of the night. I guess in some cases it was bad enough to wake up the wives, but they would notice that they would start to breathe heavily and then struggle to breathe and then stop breathing. They did often claim that these deaths were preceded by terrible nightmares that kept them from sleeping for days on end. In fact, Wes Craven, in an interview one time, described a case that he read about where a young man started having nightmares so bad that he took pills and drank coffee to stay awake for something like 6 days before he finally fell asleep and then died in his sleep. Now, I will say, I looked around, I wasn't able to find that story, so it's possible he was just, embellishing for the sake of promotion. Now, there have been a few hypotheses that have been explored to try to explain SUNS. The first one, and least likely in my opinion, is the supernatural explanation. Specifically, a demon called the Dab Zog. According to Hmong mythology, the Dab Zog was a nightmare spirit that would kill you in your sleep by crushing you to death. People who have survived the ordeal describe a moment when the sleeper becomes aware of a presence in the room, a feeling of impending evil. It's at this moment that they realize that they can't move. They're frozen in fear as the spirit appears in the corner of the room. They lie there helpless as it creeps over to them and climbs onto the bed, sitting on their chest and staring down at them as the weight makes them struggle to breathe. At this point, you wake up in a cold sweat, if you're lucky. The Dab Zog is thought to target people who have not adequately paid respect to their ancestors, which is a core practice in Hmong culture, and it targets men specifically. So, you can imagine that immigrant families that have moved away from the land of their ancestors may feel that they've disrespected them by moving away and thus be targeted by the Dab Zog. By the way, this idea of a sleep demon that sits on your chest and crushes you or prevents you from breathing, it's not unique to the Hmong people, not by a long shot. Interestingly, this is a very common phenomenon around the world. In Western culture, it's often called the night hag. In fact, the term nightmare was originally nightmare, a mare being a night hag in Scandinavian folklore. Now, if all of this sounds a lot like sleep paralysis to you, yeah, that's the leading explanation of this phenomenon. If you're lucky enough to have never experienced sleep paralysis, basically what happens is that when you fall asleep, your brain kind of paralyzes your body so that you can dream without, acting out what you're doing in your dream. It doesn't always work, as anybody who's ever been elbowed in the face by their spouse can tell you. But sometimes it can go the other way, causing you to be frozen and unable to move while in a half-awake, half-dream state. Meaning you feel like you're awake, but you can't move, and then, weird dream shit starts to happen around you. And if that dream turns out to be a nightmare, it can be a terrifying experience. So imagine you're from a culture that heavily believes in demonic spirits and that they'll attack you for not properly respecting your ancestors. And you're carrying around tons of guilt for leaving the homeland of those ancestors, and your brain is just pulsing with extreme PTSD from the war that forced you to go in the first place. You're in a strange place that maybe hasn't always made you exactly feel welcome, and there are dozens of stories of other people who have died from these spirits. And then, in the middle of the night, you wake up and realize you can't move. And you look over and you see something in the corner of the room. It might be enough to make you die of fright. The brain is a powerful thing. And the more people this happens to, the more fear and anxiety around it rises, which only makes it more likely to happen. It becomes kind of a social contagion, like the dancing plague. So while an actual demonic spirit murdering people is not very likely, belief in a demonic spirit murdering people is fairly plausible. But what if this explanation has it backwards? What if it's not the fear causing the heart problem, but a heart problem causing the fear? In other words, it's possible that they are actually experiencing an actual heart arrhythmia, and the pain and discomfort they're feeling manifests in a dream state as a demon sitting on their chest. This has led some to point the finger at a condition called Brugada syndrome, or BRS. Brugada syndrome is an inherited and thankfully rare cardiac disease that causes the heart to go into arrhythmia, meaning the chambers are not contracting in the right order and the heart fails to pump blood effectively. This is also known as an arrhythmogenic disease. People with Brugada syndrome run an increased risk of ventricular fibrillation and sudden cardiac death. And some of the symptoms include fainting spells, seizures, and labored nocturnal breathing, which tracks. BRS was first described in 1992 by a research on 8 patients who were resuscitated from sudden cardiac death because of ventricular fibrillation. And approximately 11 to 28% of patients with BRS were found to be carriers of a genetic mutation, the majority of which were located on the SCN5A gene, which regulates the voltage-gated cardiac sodium channel. Now, this can be inherited, which might be an explanation because the Hmong originated from, isolated mountain communities. But if that's the case, there'd be evidence of this back in their homeland, which I wasn't really able to find in my research. Now, granted, Brugada is rare, and it's unlikely that widespread testing has been done to find it back in Laos. But again, it kind of goes back to the problem that SUNs seem to only affect Hmong immigrants. And if it was inherited, you'd probably see a lot of it back there too. Now, one explanation for that researchers have considered is epigenetic mutations. Epigenetics involves gene mutations caused by environmental factors, and there is some evidence to show that the SCN5A gene can be affected by extreme stress. Extreme stress like, maybe a civil war. Now, on the subject of the war, there is another war-related theory worth discussing. Now, I did say that before that none of the victims showed any signs of heart problems, but there have been some physiological anomalies that have sparked a few theories. So in the 80s, when all of this was going on, a doctor named Frederick Eckners looked at the hearts of some of the victims, and he found a commonality between all of them. They all had a frayed and twisted sinoatrial node. This matters because the sinoatrial node is a nerve that sends impulses to start the heartbeat. This has led some researchers to speculate that chemicals used during the war may be to blame. There is definitely precedence for this. You may have heard of Agent Orange, but in case you don't know what it was, Agent Orange was a defoliant, meaning it stripped the leaves off of trees. Vietnam being a jungle region, it made it easy for the Viet Cong to hide in the thick foliage, and it made it especially hard to see them from the air, so the US used defoliants to get rid of all that pesky leaf coverage. So Agent Orange could be considered chemical warfare, but it wasn't used directly on people. It wasn't like a nerve gas to kill people directly. It just, made it easier for the bullets to find them. But it did infamously affect people's nervous systems, including that of US soldiers, the consequences of which we've been dealing with for decades. That also includes birth defects, which, if you're running low on nightmare fuel, feel free to Google Agent Orange birth defects. I will not be showing that here. And while Agent Orange hasn't been connected to this specific issue of the sinoatrial node, it wasn't the only chemical that was used and dumped on the jungles of Vietnam and the surrounding countries. Not to mention, with war comes lots of fire. Fires release all kinds of chemicals into the air, and it gets breathed in, does all kinds of damage, some of which takes years to manifest. Now, the counter-argument to this is that such a chemical wouldn't have this kind of effects after so much time has gone by since exposure. But I mean, just recently the US government admitted that burn pits in the Iraq War led to massive upticks in cancers for service members. But in the end, it might be a combination of all these things. Chemical exposure, cultural beliefs, genetic abnormalities combined with overwhelming PTSD. And I brought up the PTSD thing several times, kind of ambiguously without getting into specifics, so you might be wondering what it was about their situation that was so traumatic. I mean, obviously war is traumatic, and being a refugee on top of that even more so, but the plight of the Hmong people is especially brutal. Here in the US, we're deeply familiar with the Vietnam War. It defined an entire era of the 20th century and left divisions and scars that we're still working to heal. But the violence of the Vietnam War didn't happen here in our backyards. It happened there, in their backyards. And it wasn't just in Vietnam. What we think of as the Vietnam War was really a regional conflict that spread across several countries, including Cambodia and Laos, and spawned brutal civil wars in both of those countries. The killing fields of Cambodia and the reign of terror of the Khmer Rouge have been well documented, but what happened in Laos has kind of been missed by a lot of us. First of all, the US needed to shut down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This was a supply line that fed weapons and people to the Viet Cong, and it ran through Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. The easiest way to do this was to bomb from the air. So they did. A lot. Laos especially. It was a mountainous region covered by forests, and the US already was embroiled in a ground war in Vietnam. They didn't want to risk more casualties by doing the same thing in an even more inhospitable area, so yeah, bombing became the tactic. Starting in 1964, the US began flying covert bombing missions out of Thailand under the codename Operation Barrel Roll. Hundreds of AC-130s and B-52s filled with cluster bombs and other ordnance would eventually drop over 2 million tons of bombs between 1964 and 1973. That comes out to an estimated 260 million bombs. Or, to put this another way, it's an equivalent of a plane load of bombs being dropped on the country every 8 minutes, 24 hours a day, for 9 years. In fact, Laos holds the record for the most bombed country in human history. And by the way, many of those bombs didn't explode on impact. They would only explode years later, so the people of Laos have been dealing with that problem ever since. Something like 20,000 Laotians have been killed or injured by unexploded ordnance over the years. But just to add to that horror for the Hmong people, when the communist Pathet Lao group began the rise in power in Laos, the CIA recruited and trained Hmong soldiers to fight and repel the communist forces. This led to the aforementioned Laos Civil War. The communist forces would eventually prevail in Laos, which led to a brutal wave of reprisals against the Hmong for having worked with the US. Hmong families were hunted down and massacred in what many have called a genocide. By 1976, 10% of the population of Laos was dead. Double that was wounded or injured, and a full quarter of the country had become refugees, hundreds of thousands of which made their way to the US, which is where our story began. It's hard to say how history would have changed if Kennedy had not been assassinated, but many speculate that our involvement in Vietnam would have been severely reduced or delayed at the very least. According to many sources, he was unwilling to fully commit to the war in Vietnam. In fact, he ordered a small troop withdrawal just a month before he was killed. On Elm Street. And I think that's it for now. You guys go out there, have an eye-opening rest of the week. Stay safe, and I'll see you next Monday. Love you guys. Take care. On May 31st of 2014, three 12-year-old girls entered the woods outside of Waukesha, Wisconsin to play a game of hide-and-seek. Nothing unusual about that. Kids play hide-and-seek all the time. What was different about this game was that it ended with two of the girls stabbing the third girl 19 times. This wasn't the agreed-upon punishment for losing the game. No, this was their attempt to appease Slender Man. Slender Man was a creepypasta that first showed up on the website Something Awful that became really popular, eventually became a bit of an online urban legend. There were movies and video games made about it and everything. And yeah, I don't know, for whatever reason, these two girls believed that by killing their friend, they would get the approval of Slender Man. It sparked a whole series of debates about the internet and the dangers of giving impressionable kids access to everything on it that now has totally been resolved. No, it hasn't. Slender Man, of course, is nowhere near the first urban legend. While the internet may have made it possible for urban legends to spread a lot more quickly, urban legends have been around as long as urban areas have been around. But there is one that is considered the first urban legend, and it was called Spring-Heeled Jack. And it was a real person, supposedly, but his influence can still be seen in pop culture today. To understand the origin of Spring-Heeled Jack, we kind of have to start by talking about the Victorian era, specifically what was going on in jolly old London, eh? Nailed it. The Victorian age refers to the reign of Queen Victoria of England, which lasted from 1837 to 1901, and if there was one word that sums up the Victorian era, it's change. It was a period of profound change, and profound social repression, but we'll get to that later. But no, I've argued before that I think maybe the 1800s might have been the most transformative century in all of human history, in the sense that, like, somebody living in 1801 was basically living the same way as their ancestors had for the last 1,000 years. By 1901, there were cars on the road, and most people lived in cities and worked in factories. That's a very simplistic version of that argument, but the point is that advances in technology changed communication and transportation in ways that we had never seen before. And the worldwide epicenter of all that change was in London. London's population rose from 1.9 million in 1801 to 6.2 million in 1897, spurred on by innovations like sewer systems and subways and electricity. But Victorian London was also kind of a nightmare. Class division was baked into Victorian society, and nowhere was that more on display than London. If you were one of the have-nots, you stayed one of the have-nots for the entirety of your life. Luckily, lifespans were incredibly short. People lived packed into squalid tenements, the streets were caked with manure and trash, infectious disease rampaged the population, and smoke from chimneys and coal plants was choking. Just read any Charles Dickens book, he didn't make that stuff up, folks. Plus, there was the fact that there was all this new technology and a lot of it wasn't really understood. Lead and arsenic was used in all kinds of household products, mercury poisoning was common. I mean, I could do a whole video about how everything in the Victorian era wanted to kill you. But maybe because there was so much changing so fast, the Victorian society became extremely socially repressive, sort of as a backlash to it, as a way to preserve the traditions that, had made them who they were. And of course, these traditions mostly benefited the upper classes. Victorians were obsessed with class structures and created complicated rules around it, like just interacting with anybody was a social minefield. Like, you could not approach somebody to speak to them in any way that was in a higher station than you. Like, you could go to jail for that. And women were particularly controlled to where you could go, who you could talk to, how you drank your tea. Pretty much every decision you made was predetermined for you. But men, on the other hand, were literally expected to die, as opposed to breaking a social norm. The whole women and children on the lifeboats thing. The sense of helplessness that comes with being stuck in a rigid class system that's pretty much a death sentence if you're below a certain point, in a city filled with smoke and narrow alleyways riddled with crime, was a recipe for some really interesting chaos to happen. And in September of 1837, one particular bit of chaos sprang out of the dark streets of London. Quite literally. A woman named Polly Adams was leaving a bar called the Green Man with some friends, and as they were walking through the Blackheath district, a black-cloaked figure jumped out of the shadows and attacked them. Supposedly, he smelled of sulfur and spit blue fire at the group. He then leapt toward Polly and began to, tear at her clothes with these metal clawed hands, and her friends ran away, terrified. Friends. And then, pretty much without warning, he just stopped and ran away into the night, laughing, leaving her laying there, tattered and bloody with scratches across her abdomen. Just a random attack from a weird guy. A month later, the same person / creature / demon attacked another woman, this one named Mary Stevens. Mary worked as a servant in Lavender Hill, south of the Thames, and as she was leaving her parents' house, walking back to her job, she passed through a park called Clapham Commons. And as she was exiting the park, this same cloaked figure jumped out of the darkness, shot blue flame out of his face, and began to tear at her with these metal claws. But unlike Polly, he sort of sexually attacked her. He began kissing all over her. Mary screamed at the top of her lungs, apparently loud enough to get the attention of other people, and this guy let her go and ran off into the night, again, laughing. But it was the next sighting that earned this mystery man his iconic name. According to the story, a carriage was passing through the London streets when this same dark-cloaked man jumped in front of the carriage and scared the horses so bad that it tipped over. The driver of the carriage chased after this man, who was cackling with laughter, but as he got close to him, apparently this man jumped clear over a 9-foot fence. And that is how this weird, creepy dude earned the name Spring-Heeled Jack. Now, did this guy actually have some kind of spring device in his shoes that allowed him to jump over high walls? Did he have some kind of rope device? Were there rockets that hadn't been invented yet? Or was he just the world's first parkour artist?
Parkour! Parkour!
I mean, granted, the driver said that he leapt it in a single bound, but people's memories can be sketchy. In fact, there's something called the Yerkes-Dodson law of arousal that states that at low and high anxiety levels, our memories are pretty sketchy. It's kind of somewhere in the middle where we're having middle levels of anxiety that our memories lock in a lot better. So, in this case, maybe he didn't actually clear it in one jump. Maybe the wall wasn't actually 9 feet high. There may have been some embellishments there. Not to mention it was dark and foggy, but regardless of the details, with this one jump, an urban legend was born. Headlines swept the newspapers of this dark figure attacking women and causing panic in the streets of London. 3 months after the attacks, the Lord Mayor of London, John Cowan, received an anonymous letter claiming that the Spring-Heeled Jack attacks were actually pranks by the aristocrats of London. This becomes very important later on. And that same mayor in January the next year showed off a pile of letters that he had received from various people claiming to have been attacked by Spring-Heeled Jack. Which all or most of these accounts claim that Jack had red glowing eyes, clawed metal hands, the ability to jump really high, and always managed to get away. Now, because most of these claims weren't verified by police or medical reports or anything like that, they aren't really considered canon. But the next one very much was. The woman's name was Jane Alsop, and as the story goes, she was sitting at home when somebody knocked on the door, so she opened the door. Remember how we used to open doors? And outside was a man claiming that he had found Spring-Heeled Jack and needed a candle to see. So she obliged, but as she approached to give him a candle, the man apparently pulled up his cloak and shot, again, blue flame at her face. She described him as wearing a large helmet, a white oilskin clothing, and red eyes that glowed with fire. Which I have to say is really handy when you need to light a candle. After he stunned her with the blue flame, he leaped on top of her, began scratching at her with the metal claws, and then pulled her out onto the stoop. Unfortunately for Jane, this attack seems to have been a lot more vicious than the other ones. He did manage to scratch her pretty deeply on the abdomen and on the neck, and she lost large patches of hair as well. Luckily, her dad rushed to the scene and scared the guy away. Now, what was unique about this attack, outside of it being especially vicious, is that Jane was a member of the upper class. And because this was Victorian London and class means everything, now it was something to take seriously. The Duke of Wellington, the Iron Duke who defeated Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, went out into the London night stating that he would track down Spring-Heeled Jack after hearing about Jane's attack. This 70-year-old man patrolled the streets at night with a rifle in hand for weeks, but was never able to catch the fiend. Shortly after the Jane Alsop attack, probably while the Iron Duke was off somewhere else in the city, a woman named Lucy Scales and her sister were passing through the Green Dragon alley when a man dressed as a policeman approached them with a lantern in hand. And just as Jane began to speak to him, he shot the famous blue flame into her face. But this freaked her out so much that she had a seizure. And maybe because he was satisfied with what he had done, or maybe because he was freaked out by the seizure, the man just kind of ran away. Newspapers were filled with reports of his attacks, and lurid tales of his exploits filled the penny dreadfuls, which were kind of like Pulp Fiction magazines of their day. And there were theater performances, Punch and Judy puppet shows, and preachers declaring that Spring-Heeled Jack was a demon punishing London for its wicked ways. And then Jack went silent for a while. Maybe things just got a little too hot for him. Maybe he had achieved his goals of panic in the streets, agent of chaos as it were. Or maybe he stopped leaving his victims alive. Jack sprang up again in 1843 in Northamptonshire, earning him a new nickname, Travelin' Jack. Actually, that's not true, but that would have been awesome. The reports at the time claimed to see him jumping from rooftop to rooftop, quote, looking like the devil himself. In 1847, he popped up in Teignmouth, Devon, which was also related to the phenomenon of the devil's footprints that showed up in Devon in 1855. Some interesting Jack-related action occurred in Lincolnshire, where he was apparently shot at while jumping across rooftops, and apparently the bullets just kind of ricocheted off of him with a metallic sound. He even attacked a military base in Aldershot in Surrey County, where he would apparently sneak up on soldiers and slap them when they weren't looking. Apparently he did it one time with a fish. Later stories would be attributed to him, like a report in the News of the World in November of 1872 of the Peckham Ghost, claiming it was none other than Spring-Heeled Jack, who terrified a past generation. Similar stories published in the Illustrated Police News in April and May of 1873 reported sightings in Sheffield of the Park Ghost, which locals attributed to Spring-Heeled Jack. The last reported Jack sighting occurred in Liverpool in 1904. Witnesses reported seeing a guy bounding down the street before jumping up onto the rooftops and leaping away forever. And with that, Spring-Heeled Jack's reign of terror was over. Now, outside of a supernatural explanation, demons, aliens, and the like, it's probably unlikely that Spring-Heeled Jack was one guy doing all those things. I mean, that would have been a pretty spry 80-year-old in 1904. The most accepted theory is that everything following the original London attacks in the 1830s were just copycats and urban legends. Victorian creepypasta, if you will. But there were several real people that were really attacked and injured by someone. And after 150 years, that someone remains a mystery. But there are some theories and clues that lead to some interesting speculation. For example, many people claim that he smelled like sulfur. Now, to the people at the time, that was just proof that he was the devil or a demon from hell. But, interesting thing about sulfur, it burns blue. And a blue flame was one of Jack's calling cards. It could be possible he was blowing sulfur dust out of his hand or through some kind of device in his mouth that ignited it. So, some speculate that he might have been an educated man or had some kind of advanced knowledge of chemistry. Of course, back in those days, only the upper classes had access to advanced education, and Spring-Heeled Jack was known to wear fine clothes. And if you remember, the mayor did get that anonymous letter claiming that Spring-Heeled Jack was just a prank by the elite aristocrats of London. Given the severity of the attacks, one would assume that this was a particularly sadistic aristocrat. And there was one guy that kind of fit that bill. He was the Marquess of Waterford. Yeah, this guy was a real piece of work. He kind of lucked into his position due to some deaths in his family, if you want to call that luck, but maybe because of the childhood trauma that was associated with that, he kind of became a cruel and sadistic monster. He was known to just kind of turn over apple carts as he was walking through town, and he would start fights just to start fights, and would sometimes even get into the fights with the officers that came to break up the fights. He was a drunkard that would just walk around in a drunken state trying to pick fights with people everywhere he went. He would even pay people to fight him. There was a story about how one time he abused a bunch of Glee singers while naked, which, if you've seen the show Glee, I mean, it's kind of understandable. And I think he's actually where the term paint the town red came from, because there was an incident where he and some fellow douchebag lords got super drunk, started a little mini riot in town, and went through breaking windows and stealing door knockers off of doors and whatnot, and stole some red paint and just painted a bunch of stuff. And because they were so respectful of the legal system there, when they showed up for court, they were wearing bearskins. He was in the upper class of Victorian London, which meant he was pretty much untouchable. And he loved to spread chaos wherever he went and had no qualms about hurting people. There is one small problem with this theory, though. He only had one leg. Apparently one time he commissioned a new yacht, and when he received it, he and his buds were having some fun and celebrating and, blowing off cannons like you do. And one of those cannons blew off his leg. Seriously, no matter how rich you are, you can still be a redneck. Anyway, kind of hard to leap tall fences in a single bound when you only have one leg, although it could have been one of his douchebag friends that was doing it. Long story short, he's been speculated as a culprit for Spring-Heeled Jack for a long time, but there's never really been any proof of it. There was, however, one person that was convicted of a couple of Spring-Heeled Jack attacks. In July 1847, an investigation into the attacks in Teignmouth, Devon that I was talking about earlier led to a guy getting convicted of 2 charges of assault against women. Be this man a copycat or not, he did fit the bill. He had a skin coat that, quote, had the appearance of a bullock's hide, along with a skull cap and a mask with horns. The name of the man was Captain Finch, and he was described as, quote, a man of alleged ill health and apparently 60 years of age, about the last person that could have been suspected. Despite that, and despite the fact that the judge had reservations about accusing an old soldier of assaulting women, he was found guilty on 2 counts, but he was charged 17 shillings each, which was a total slap on the wrist. Regardless of anything, he was one of the copycats. The original Spring-Heeled Jack has never been found. The Spring-Heeled Jack frenzy is mostly forgotten these days. He was considered more of a prankster than a monster, like the serial killers that would follow, like Jack the Ripper. He's been so mythologized through the Penny Dreadfuls over the years that it's kind of difficult to separate myth from reality. And in fact, paradoxically, he kind of became a bit of a superhero over time. One popular Penny Dreadful author named Alfred Barrage, who wrote under the name A.M. Barrage, kind of leaned into the whole idea of Spring-Heeled Jack as an aristocrat who did this stuff at night, but he put a little bit of a twist on it, and instead of making him somebody that was out terrorizing the good people of London, he was out terrorizing the criminals and the evildoers. He became a dark vigilante, the avenger of the night, who used his vast wealth to construct an underground lair where he used his technological skills to create weapons that he would use to defeat the bad guys. Sound familiar at all? Now, there have been a lot of characters that fit into the trope of the wealthy guy who uses his resources to help out the little man, but very few of them were illustrated dressed like a bat. Now, there's no way to know exactly how much Spring-Heeled Jack may have influenced Bob Kane when he created Batman, but it's an interesting thought that you could tie all of the iterations of Batman through the years, all the way back through these pulpy Penny Dreadfuls to this one weird Victorian guy that had a thing for sulfur. And I know I, for one, Can't wait for Christopher Nolan's Dark Jack trilogy. All right, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. You guys go out there, have an eye-opening rest of the week, and I'll see you next Monday. Love you guys. Take care. Spring Heel Jack, by the way, just one of several mystery stories that I cover in the Book of Mysteries, the Last Smarter Book of Mysteries that came out just about a month ago. I know a lot of you guys have already purchased this book, and it's deeply, deeply appreciated that you did. I know a lot of people are giving them out for Christmas presents. I know I have a stack of them that I'm giving out for Christmas presents. I mentioned the documentary earlier. I worked 4 years on that one. We worked about 2 years on this one to put this together. It's a collection of some of the best mystery stories that we've covered on this channel, put in book form and chapter form, and a few stories that I've never covered on this channel, and I never will. They're going to be exclusive to this book. It's a collection of natural mysteries, mysterious deaths and disappearances, science mysteries, historical mysteries, mysterious people. I wrote a foreword for it. Yeah. And there are some of these that were videos that I did that there's been updates since then, so I've been able to sort of, provide updates on the story. Anyway, most of y'all already know about the book. I know I've promoted the heck out of it, and I will continue to promote it because it's, it's a big thing that I've done, and it's not just a one-time launch thing. But anyway, links down below. Go check it out. So I've talked about how much time I spent on this book and how much time I spent on the Oldest and Newest Places documentary. Neither one of those things I have worked as long on as this channel that you're watching right now, as this next video will prove. I was quite young in this one. My beard is an entirely different color. Enjoy. It's time for another Ask Joe. Eric Grubbs writes, how do the Home Alone movies stack up after all these years? I really can't believe that you've asked me this, because this is actually a movie I've been thinking a lot about lately, and how the older I get, the crazier and more twisted and sick and weird this movie becomes. It's basically Saw for kids. The Week did a breakdown of the injuries that the robbers incur throughout the making of this film, and it's actually pretty serious. These guys were lucky to survive. They get a BB to the forehead that would penetrate to the skull, an iron to the face that would shatter your sinuses, glowing a red-hot doorknob that would probably be close to 750 degrees and make your hand almost burst into flames, a blowtorch to the head that would be so severe it would require a skull bone transplant, and then standing there for a ridiculously long time, walking on broken glass, paint cans that would shatter every bone in your face and cause you to lose most of your teeth, nails through the feet, multiple hard falls on solid concrete, and falling 3 stories to the ground with enough force to break your back. And kids love this movie. Do yourself a favor and watch the movie with a bunch of kids sometime. The way they just howl with laughter more and more after each sick and depraved act against these robbers, it actually adds to the joy of the movie. I gotta be honest, it really makes it more fun to watch. Until you drive home and start thinking about all the horrors that these kids were laughing at, and you realize children are evil. And these 2 robbers, are they the dumbest criminals in the whole world? They're casing the house throughout the entire movie, and yet somehow miss all the times that Kevin goes to the store, Kevin shoplifts a toothbrush, Kevin goes to the church and just hangs out for a while. The kid leaves like 10 times and they never think, hey, maybe this would be a good time to go rob a house with the worst security alarm in the world. I mean, they even left their garage wide open. What's with these people? And what's the deal with this house? They've literally just robbed every single house on the block and they could get away with it scot-free, but no, they're gonna risk it all to rob this one house with no reason given other than, it's the big tuna. What does that mean? Does Kevin's dad have some world record $1 million tuna laying around the house somewhere? What's so special about this house? It would make sense if there was some kind of specific item that they wanted to go get, like the Hope Diamond or the Declaration of Independence or a bike. Seriously, I didn't see anything in that house that looked so amazing that it would be worth risking your life over to go rob, even though there's clearly somebody in there that could easily call the police. Wait, why didn't he call the police? Literally one phone call and every problem in this entire movie is immediately solved. Maybe he thought he'd get in trouble because he thought he made his family disappear. But still, that was never said. Which they could easily have done because he spends the entire movie talking to himself. This kid has some mental problems. He takes a shower and then he stands in front of the mirror naked and then talks as if he's having an actual conversation with himself. I mean, I get why they did it, for story reasons, for exposition, but still, how disconnected is this kid? I get the feeling that if his family was gone for another week, he'd wind up cutting his hand and smearing it on a volleyball. Having said this, I talk to myself all the time. Actually, there's nobody else in this room right now. And can we talk about how terrible this family is? Listen to the way they talk to him. The uncle calls him a jerk. His brother calls him a flimwad. His cousin says he's les incompetents. Hey, parenting tip. If another kid calls your son a disease, do something. And Kevin's just as bad as they are. He calls his mother an idiot. When she tells him to pack, he says, "Get off the phone and make me, why don't ya?" Seriously, someday that family is gonna die in a tragic accident and everybody's gonna think that he killed him. Wait a second, what if old man Marley is actually Kevin when he gets older? He's seeing what he's gonna become if he doesn't treat his family better and stop talking to himself. But isn't old man Marley supposed to be Jesus? I mean, he doesn't do anything but scare Kevin until he goes to a church, at which point he becomes nice, gives him some great sage advice, and then they shake hands and they pay special attention to focus on the band-aid on the back of his hand, covering up a wound on his hand. Like, you know, am I the only one that has that theory? So if I were remaking Home Alone, here's how it would go down. 1, I'd make the kid a girl, switch up the genders a little bit. In fact, make her an Asian girl, get some diversity in there. 2, her father is a Chinese consulate and just received a package from the Triad, a priceless jade dragon that's filled, unbeknownst to him, with seeds from some special kind of opium plant. 3, the father leaves on a business trip and it's Christmas, so all the staff has gone home, leaving Mai Lin alone with the caretaker. 4, a team of ninjas from a rival drug cartel storm the compound. They disable the security team around the perimeter and then close in on the house. At which point we find out that the caretaker was working with them all along. 5, Mai Lin runs through the caretaker with a curtain rod and then runs to her father's office, grabs a key, opens up the armory behind a secret bookshelf, revealing an entire cache of modern and classical weapons. Thus begins an hour-long shootout through this mansion between a team of drug-fueled ninjas and a 9-year-old girl wearing samurai armor, armed with an AK-47, soundtrack by Florida, directed by Michael Bay, and we done, son! Hey everybody, thanks for watching this video. Click the subscribe button up above so you can get more of my videos every single week. Check out my social media places down below if you want to see last week's video. I think it's over there. And if you want to check out a little something about a movie that I'm working on, it's right over here. I hope you're having a really great Christmas, Hanukkah, whatever holiday you're celebrating. I hope it's joyous. And I think I'll see you one more time before the end of the year, but until then, take care. It's October. It's a spooky time of year. And if you're like me, you like to watch spooky stuff in October. And one of my favorite spooky things to watch on YouTube are abandoned places videos. There are a ton of YouTube videos and whole channels dedicated to urban exploration, things like abandoned factories, abandoned schools, abandoned malls. Those are actually some of the creepiest in my opinion. You know, there's something about abandoned places, that dichotomy of this place that's made for people, but there's no people there. You know, you can't help but feel like, why was it abandoned? What happened to the people that were there? What kind of stories does this place have? You know, even just an abandoned building is creepy, but then there's entire towns that have been abandoned, ghost towns. Entire communities that were once bustling with families and life and business, now sitting empty and quiet, slowly being reconsumed by nature. If you wanted to, say, create a super creepy video game, a ghost town would be a pretty great place to do it. And that's exactly what Konami did in 1999 with their breakout hit Silent Hill. Silent Hill is set in an abandoned town called Silent Hill, West Virginia, where the story has it that they had a mine fire underneath the town, and it, you know, people abandoned it for that. But then in the game, as you explore the town, you find out that actually, you know, underneath it is this sort of underworld of ghoulish, nightmarish creatures and serial killers and monsters and yeah, I'm not a gamer, so that's really all I know about Silent Hill. But I do know it was a really popular video game that spawned an entire franchise and a couple of movies that I've been told are garbage. And I know that Silent Hill was inspired by a real place, not in West Virginia, but in Pennsylvania. It's called Centralia, Pennsylvania, and while it doesn't sit on top of a portal to the netherworld, what is going on underneath the town has made it one of the most interesting ghost towns in America. To understand what happened in Centralia, you have to understand at least a little bit about how coal forms, because like a lot of the small towns that sprang up in the Appalachian area in the early 1800s, Centralia is a coal mining town. I'm sorry, Centralia was a coal mining town. So we all know that coal forms from organic plants, especially peat, that over time the geological processes compress it and heat it up, and eventually it pushes all the carbon atoms together until it becomes this form of rock that has the neat little ability to, catch fire. And some of the most conducive areas to create the plant life and the peat that's required to create coal over time are marshes and swamps that are fed by rivers. These rivers and waterways change directions and snake through the area over time as sediment builds up. Sometimes floods wash in and bury the whole area with sediment, and then it all starts all over again. And over millions of years, as those swampy, peaty riverbeds compress, they form seams of coal that worm through the sedimentary rock. So coal mining in areas like this is basically a process of finding those coal seams and then just kind of following them wherever they go through the earth, and it creates these labyrinthine tunnels that can pop in and out of the ground and then go down deep and wind left and right and up and down, and these weird three-dimensional things with ventilation shafts everywhere. It gets really confusing. So mapping these mines was crucial, especially in the early days, because cave-ins were common, accidents happened, and you had to be able to go and rescue people in the case of mine fires. Because mine fires were a thing that happened a lot. The whole thing about coal is that it burns. And then you have these mines that are filled, the whole air is filled with particulate coal dust that just floats around. And then they're also using gas lamps to see their way and illuminate the mines. And they use explosives to blow out new rock and clear the path to follow the seam even further. It's actually amazing there weren't more mine fires back in the day. Mining disasters were just kind of a part of the way of life for a lot of these mining communities, especially back in the old days when it was completely unregulated. You'd have cave-ins, natural gas explosions, leaks of toxic poisonous gas, mine fires, the list goes on. The worst mining accident in U.S. history was in Minoga, West Virginia in 1907. It was a natural gas explosion that had an official death toll of 362, but many think that it could have actually been up to over 500. Most of the victims were Italian immigrants and children. The worst accident ever was actually a mine fire in China in 1942. It was a mine that was run by the Japanese, and at the time they didn't really have the best record in dealing with the Chinese. But yeah, this one was a mine fire, and they decided the best way to stop it was to sort of cap it to prevent the oxygen from getting in and feeding the fire, which makes sense. The only thing is they didn't bother to, let the miners out. So 1,500 miners died from carbon monoxide poisoning. Yeah, I believe the word you're looking for here is damn. So for Centralia, Pennsylvania, mining disasters on a much smaller scale were a pretty common thing. It was a mining town going back to the 1850s. Centralia sat over a large deposit of anthracite coal, which is the most pure form of coal, so it was highly prized by the mostly Italian immigrants that settled there. It was never a large town. The population peaked at around 2,700 in 1890, and most of those people were miners, families of miners, or people who ran services that serviced the miners. The Depression hit the coal industry pretty hard, and Centralia suffered right along with a lot of the other towns in the area, but it wasn't quite a knockout punch. They kept going. Also, just energy use kind of changed a little bit. It switched to more petroleum and oil-based over coal. So the population would continue to dwindle over the first half of the 20th century, and by 1960, only about 1,500 people lived in Centralia. But they were about to experience the most epic slow burn of all time. So as the story goes, in May of 1962, the city council wanted to sort of clean up the landfill a little bit in preparation for Memorial Day festivities, and the way that they chose to do that was by setting it on fire. This wasn't an uncommon thing back in that day, but in this particular case, the fire somehow, we don't really know how, but it somehow spread into one of these underground mine shafts. Next thing you know, there was a fire raging in a coal seam underneath Centralia. And that wasn't a big deal. They didn't really take it that seriously. Like I said, they'd had many disasters and accidents over the years, so they didn't really think too strongly about it. But they did need to shut down the mines because there was carbon monoxide building up in there. They tried to suffocate the fire by shutting off access to oxygen, but the problem was, like I said, it was so labyrinthine inside of it. There were so many different ventilation shafts and places that it was impossible. The fire spread so fast that it eventually became clear that there was no containing it. And any solutions that they did come up with were just way too expensive. So the mines were shut down permanently, and mining in Centralia, Pennsylvania was officially a thing of the past. Now this alone caused the population to dwindle over the next 20 years because, mining was the main employer of the town, so people left to find other job opportunities. This is the same thing that happened hundreds of years earlier to oil towns and gold rush towns. Once that resource is gone, the town is close behind. But add on top of that the fact that, there's this raging fire underneath the town. The ground was measured at 900 degrees Fahrenheit in some places, and people began complaining of headaches and nausea due to carbon monoxide buildup. People reported basements filling up with smoke, the ground underneath the streets became unstable, so streets became undrivable. Houses began to buckle and tilt. I mean, just imagine the foundation problems. There were even stories of graves in the cemeteries burning up and falling down into fire pits below. I mean, that's some horror movie shit right there. But still, many of the townspeople held on. It wasn't because they thought the fire was going to go out. Geologists predicted that it was going to be going for a couple hundred years, probably. But, this was their home, and they didn't want to leave. But there was also the financial problem of, even if you want to move, who are you going to sell your house to? Not a lot of people looking to buy a home that's teetering on the edge of a hellish cauldron of flame. And if you own a mortgage, or if you have a mortgage on this house and you're still paying on it, you're kind of stuck there. Besides, many people felt perfectly safe there. This fire had been going for a couple of decades at this point. I mean, it's not like it had hurt anybody. I mean, it's not like the ground had given way underneath somebody's feet, causing them to fall into a burning cauldron hundreds of feet deep or anything. You can see where this is going. On Valentine's Day in 1981, a 12-year-old boy named Todd Dombrowski was walking across his grandmother's yard when a sinkhole opened up underneath him, dropping him into a cavern 150 feet high. And just about the biggest stroke of luck I've ever heard of, there was a tree root that just happened to be going across that sinkhole that he was able to hang on to while a cousin went and got help. But for a lot of local and state authorities, this was the final straw. An act was passed through Congress that paid the people of Centralia for their homes to try to encourage them to move out, and many of them took them up on that offer. The population went from about 1,000 in 1980 to 63 in 1990. These were the holdouts, and they fought tooth and nail to hang on to their residency there in Centralia, but even their days were numbered. In 1992, the state of Pennsylvania condemned all the buildings in Centralia to try to, finally force everybody out. They stopped running mail there, and they eventually turned to eminent domain. Today, there are officially 7 residents in Centralia, and the authorities have kind of just decided to let them stay there as long as they take responsibility for their own risk and everything. Nobody wants to be seen as the politician that forced people out of their homes. They are, however, banned from selling or passing on their homes to anybody in the future. Today, Centralia is more of a quirky tourist spot than anything. Now, there's not really much to see there. After the residents left, the state just bulldozed all the homes and buildings there, which was heavily contested by the residents. I mean, they're watching their homes where they grew up being torn to the ground. Former residents say the town is unrecognizable today. Forests have already filled in areas that were once blocks of homes with backyards with children playing. Streets are unmarked and frayed at the edges, a few foundations, a random stair step or two. And if you're lucky, you can find a vent sticking out of the ground or some random smoke, but otherwise you wouldn't know that the town is sitting on top of a brick pizza oven. In a bit of an epilogue, when the fires damaged Highway 61 beyond repair, the state decided that the simpler way to fix the problem is just to create a new highway that goes around the worst of the unstable ground. And the old highway kind of became a tourist attraction of its own. Somewhere along the way, visitors began tagging the abandoned highway with graffiti. After a while, it became known for it, this random stretch of mangled highway in the middle of the woods just covered with graffiti. Now known as Graffiti Highway, it was a must-see for any curious Centralia visitors. It was a place where people could leave something of themselves in this ghost town. It was a way for them to become a part of it. Graffiti Highway became the 6th most visited tourist attraction in Pennsylvania, drawing photographers and Instagrammers. Events have been held there, which didn't sit well with the locals. They complained about the usual stuff, the noise, the trash, the fact that it's an unsafe area, the fact that some of the graffiti was spilling over into private property and into the cemetery at the end of the road. But this year, as coronavirus hit and people were still gathering in large events out there, that was kind of the final straw for them. A company called Pagnotti that actually owns the land eventually got so many complaints about it that they decided that it just wasn't a risk that they were willing to bear anymore. So earlier this year, they covered up the Graffiti Highway with soil, so the Graffiti Highway is no more. A huge campaign was launched to try to save the Graffiti Highway, but yeah, it was to no avail. Just like the former residents fought to save their homes, this new group came later and tried to save their own piece of Centralia. Now, amazingly, the fire underneath Centralia is just one of 38 known mine fires in Pennsylvania that are burning right now. Now, none of the others are threatening any small towns that I'm aware of anyway that I could find, but around the world, Centralia isn't alone. Nor is it the worst. In Jharia, India, over 70 different mine fires going back to the 1800s have eventually coalesced into one giant mine fire that's swallowed homes, destroyed train tracks, even drained a river. Yeah, in 1995, a riverbank collapsed that drained a river into a mine shaft that killed 78 workers. And the Jharia fire is not just a problem because of the destruction of property and whatnot that's going on. It also pumps thousands of tons of CO2 into the atmosphere every year. A burning coal seam in Brandenburg, Germany has been burning since 1688. They don't know exactly how it started, but to this day, visitors can go and you can see steam and smoke coming out of the ground. And apparently back in the day, kids used to go and steam eggs over some of these cracks. I guess steaming eggs was like the PlayStation of its time. But if a 300-year burning fire sounds insane, you should check out the Burning Mountain near Wingan, New South Wales in Australia. This is a fire underneath this mountain that's been burning for an estimated 6,000 years. The entirety of recorded human history, this fire has been burning. It's estimated to be traveling due south at a rate of about 1 meter per year, which would put it in Sydney in about 225,000 years. So if you live in Sydney, you better start making plans. Obviously, Sydney's not in danger anytime soon, but many other cities are, not by coal fires, but from rising sea levels. It's estimated that by 2050, 570 low-lying coastal cities are going to experience at least a half a meter of sea level rise. That equates to over 800 million people. This means more intense storms, more flooding events, and more damage to essential infrastructure and services. Some of the most vulnerable cities include Jakarta, Bangkok, Lagos, Manila, Dhaka, Shanghai, London, and Houston, which is not only right at sea level, but is actually sinking due to the extraction of groundwater oil and natural gas underneath. Assuming things continue at this current rate, millions of people are going to find themselves in a similar situation to the people of Centralia. In fact, I would argue that the small towns are in even more danger than the big cities because, of course, they're going to focus more attention on saving the big population hubs because more people there. I mean, how are people going to react when it becomes obvious that the place that they live, the place that they call home, isn't safe anymore? Human beings have a very strong connection to place. It's part of our identity. It's part of our history. You know, it's a huge world with a lot of things to experience and go see, but most of us spend most of our lives pretty close to where we grew up. I'm guilty of this. I mean, I've never lived outside of a 100-mile radius of where I was born. You know, add on top of that the economic problem, again, of, you know, what do you do? Who do you sell your home to when floodwaters are lapping up against your front door? And I think you can get a good picture of what we're going to see over the next 100 years when these problems really start to manifest. Centralia is kind of a metaphor for what's going on around the world right now. You know, this hidden danger underneath our feet threatening to take away our way of life while we just kind of mostly ignore the problem and carry on, just delaying the inevitable. Centralia is the canary in the coal mine. The charred canary in the flaming coal mine. All right, that's it for now. You guys go out there, have an eye-opening week, and I'll see you next Monday. Love you guys. Take care. So, random fact, Centralia, I talk about how it inspired the game and the movie Silent Hill. It also inspired one of my favorite bad movies, Nothing But Trouble. I know, totally random fact. Dan Aykroyd, I think that's the only movie that Dan Aykroyd ever actually directed, but he got a whole lot of money and they art directed the absolute crap out of this thing. It is a bizarre, wonderful train wreck with Chevy Chase and Demi Moore and weird, like, worm people. But it's set in this town called Vulcanvania, which is like out in the middle of the Pennsylvania woods, and it's kind of falling apart because there's an underground mine that caught fire, and at the end of the movie, spoilers, like everything blows up because the mine officially blows up. But it was clearly, and I think he's actually said in an interview, it's clearly inspired by Centralia. This next video is not necessarily pop culture so much as a science thing that pop culture caught up with. You know, I remember the whole Barbenheimer summer. Well, I did a video about what would happen if every single nuclear weapon went off at the same time, which was Oppenheimer's biggest fear. Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer exploded into theaters last week, telling the story of J. Robert Oppenheimer, a nuclear physicist who led the Manhattan Project that created the first nuclear bomb, and all the moral conflicts that come with that. He would later say that seeing that first bomb go off reminded him of a line from the Bhagavad Gita, "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." He's kind of become associated with that line at this point, but according to his brother, who was there with him when the bomb went off, that's not actually what he said. What he actually said, apparently, was, "I guess it worked." Not quite as profound, but I'm sure he was thinking the other thing. Either way, I imagine as the years passed, watching the world stockpile these weapons thousands of times over was a heavy burden, to say the least. He may have truly brought about the thing that could destroy the world. But could it? Like when I was growing up, I always heard that, you know, we had made so many nuclear weapons that we could literally destroy all life on the planet, which I thought was insane. I mean, why do you need that many? Like maybe just annihilate one country? Your enemy? I mean, does it have to be all of them? Or maybe it sounds crazy because it's not actually true. The world's a big place. It's survived a lot of things. So let's look at that. What if every single nuclear weapon on Earth went off at once? What would happen? To answer this question, we first have to define some things, like, what is a nuclear weapon? Okay, simply put, a nuclear weapon is defined as a device that releases explosive energy from nuclear fission, fusion, or a combination of the two. Atomic bombs are commonly fission weapons, thermonuclear bombs, or hydrogen bombs, those are fusion weapons. Their blast energy is often referred to in terms of kilotons and megatons in equivalent weights of conventional TNT explosives. And according to the Federation of American Scientists, 9 countries possess around 12,500 nuclear warheads, as of early this year anyway. These nations are Russia, the United States, China, France, United Kingdom, Pakistan, India, Israel, and North Korea. There are also 6 nations hosting nuclear weapons, and that's Italy, Turkey, Belgium, Germany, Netherlands, and Belarus. So in total, yeah, 12,500 weapons. That's bad, sure, but not nearly as bad as during the Cold War. At one point, there was an estimated 60,000 to 70,000 weapons worldwide. According to the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, Russia holds the most confirmed nuclear weapons at 5,997. The US is next with 5,428, held in the US, Germany, Belgium, Italy, the Netherlands, and Turkey. And even though many other countries have their own nuclear weapons programs, it's still mostly a Russia and US thing. 90% of the world's nuclear weapons are in these 2 countries. And I'm using specific numbers here, but the exact number of nuclear weapons in each country is top secret, so we are going to be playing with estimates for a lot of this video. Truth is, nobody knows exactly how many nuclear weapons there are in the world, which isn't great. But yeah, to kind of break down these missiles even further, there's 2 types of weapons, strategic and non-strategic, or tactical. Strategic nuclear weapons are long range and made to directly attack another country's homeland. Non-strategic, or tactical nuclear weapons, they have a shorter range and are made for battlefield use. So, in other words, tactical weapons are used to win battles, while strategic ones are used to win wars. So tactical nuclear weapons are much smaller and don't get as much attention as the big, city-destroying kind, but there's a couple of problems with that. One, they're still nuclear weapons. Some of them are stronger than Hiroshima. And second, because they're smaller, that means they're more likely to be used. It's like, generals are a lot less likely to use a nuclear attack if they know it'll trigger a mutually assured destruction scenario. But a small one, just used to win a battle? Maybe not? Like at various times, Putin and Russia have threatened to use tactical nukes in Ukraine, but if they do, and that's still a possibility, things could get really scary really quick. Yeah, using nukes of any kind is a threshold that you just don't want to cross on any level. Or as former US Defense Secretary Jim Mattis said in 2018, I don't think there's any such thing as a tactical nuclear weapon. Any nuclear weapon used at any time is a strategic game changer. But in our scenario today, none of that politics stuff matters because we are definitely going to light all these candles. Alright, so to figure out just how bad the damage is going to be, we first have to figure out how much explosive force we're dealing with, and in nuclear weapons, that's measured in yields. So for example, the bombs that the US dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki had around 15 kilotons and 20 kilotons each, so that was their yield. And that's actually on the small side compared to many of the bombs that follow, but when you get into hydrogen bombs, you're talking about megatons of yield, literally thousands of times bigger. Hydrogen bombs literally use a fission bomb as its trigger. The force from the fission bomb then compresses the hydrogen enough to fuse that gives it almost an unlimited yield. Some of the biggest bombs ever tested were hydrogen bombs, including the biggest one, the Tsar Bomba. The Soviet Union detonated it on October 30th, 1961, and it had a yield of 50 megatons. For reference, if that bomb exploded here in Dallas today, it would cause at least third-degree burns for a 37.3-mile radius, or 60 kilometers. But nuclear weapons are double bad because it's not just the stuff that gets blown up, there's also the fallout radius. So what happens is a giant fireball is created when a nuclear weapon explodes. Everything inside the fireball vaporizes and it's carried upwards, creating the mushroom cloud that you've seen a million times. But in that mushroom cloud is all the radioactive material from the device that's vaporized and mixing with the air. Once that air cools, it condenses and forms particles that then falls back to Earth, covering everything down below. And not just below, because the wind spreads this way further than the blast site. So yeah, when you talk about nuclear blasts, you have to factor in the fallout because it irradiates everything to a dangerous level. So there are several physical effects caused by nuclear weapons. These include a thermal wave, a blast wave, an electromagnetic pulse, ionizing radiation released, and radioactive isotopes produced in fallout. Just one explosion in a city can kill thousands of people immediately. Massive overpressures would destroy most structures, high temperatures would incinerate flammable materials, and intense winds would cause firestorms. And then, of course, radiation exposure would cause short and long-term illnesses and genetic health effects. And on top of that, the world's climate and agricultural production would be severely disrupted. So that scenario is just about one explosion, or maybe a handful of them, but in reality, there's really no exact way to know or estimate the impact of one nuclear weapon. There are several variables that determine its effects, like how large the weapon is, the weather, the time of day, geography of where it explodes, and whether it explodes in the air or on the ground. But we can make some general predictions with the limited resources we have. Because this is Answers with Joe, not give up and crawl into a corner in a fetal position because the world can be a terrible place that we don't want to think about anymore with Joe. So let's go there, right? Like, what would happen if all the nuclear weapons were shot or dropped or exploded at the same time? What would that look like? And what would be left? Okay, so we're going to use data from NukeMap by Alex Wellerstein. This site gives the effects of different types of nuclear bombs going off in specific locations. So for this exercise, let's choose the W-87 warhead, which has a yield of 300 kilotons. One airborne explosion at 6,860 feet, that's 291 meters, would create a radiation radius of 1,520 feet, covering an area of 0.26 square miles. A fireball radius of 1,960 feet, covering 0.43 square miles. A moderate blast damage radius of 2.92 miles with an area of 26.9 square miles. A thermal radiation radius of 4.45 miles, covering 62.3 square miles. And a light blast damage radius of 8.22 miles, covering 212 square miles. By the way, I know I'm using imperial units, I'm converting them on screen for you guys. Please don't yell at me, those are just the numbers that we found. Now for comparison, the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima was 15 kilotons, and it completely destroyed everything in a 4.4 mile radius. So for this thought experiment, if we're using a 300 kiloton weapon as a destruction benchmark, that would be about 62.3 square miles. So let's imagine that all 12,700 nuclear weapons have 300 kilotons of power. Again, we're playing with averages here. That gives us an area of 791,210 square miles of thermal radiation if they all go off in the air. Combined, that pretty much wipes out the western US states of Arizona, California, Idaho, Nevada, Oregon, Utah, Washington, and Wyoming. Or all of Mexico. Or a third of Australia. So the Earth's combined area is around 196,900,000 square miles, so thermal radiation from all of those nukes going off at the same time would affect about 0.4% of the Earth. But that's a low average yield. Let's say the average of them is the same as, say, the 800 kiloton Russian Topol 2225 missiles. One detonated at 9,511 feet in the air would create a thermal radiation area of 148 square miles. Beep, bop, boop, and all of them going off at once would be 1,879,600 square miles of thermal radiation. That's enough to take out Alaska, California, Texas, and a few other states. Or all of India. That would also come out to about 1% of the world's surface destroyed. Now those are just like general numbers if everything was to go off, but what if there was an actual, nuclear war and someone was just trying to kill as many people as possible by directing them at cities? Around 56% of the world's population of 8 billion people live in cities or urban areas. So we're looking at about 4.4 billion people. There are also over 4,000 cities with more than 100,000 inhabitants. While some places are bigger than others, let's just say there's 3 bombs for each city. So to keep the math simple, let's stick with the 4,000 number for that. So bing, bang, boom. Again, we'd use 12,000 nukes to kill more than 4 billion people and still have around 700 warheads left. And there'd still be cockroaches, so there's that. But that's the least likely scenario. Nobody would just want to kill half of the world's population by destroying the cities. What if it was just a war between the US and Russia? Which is what we've always worried about. Well, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists claim that 4,100 kiloton nuclear warheads would lead to the immediate death of 360 million people at minimum. So somebody already did the math on that, so we'll just use it. But what if, like a rogue AI took over and decided to just blow up every single nuclear warhead right where they're stored? There would be hundreds of millions of deaths right off the bat, especially in the US and Russia since they account for 90% of the nuclear weapons. Nukes stored in submarines all exploding at the same time would create powerful tsunamis, while also killing everything within the blast radius. Although one positive is that water is a good radiation blocker, so that would at least limit the amount of radiation escaping. And finally, just for fun, what if we took all the nuclear weapons in the world and just piled them up in one spot and blew them up right there? What would that look like? Sticking with our 300 kiloton missiles, an explosion would equal 3.8 gigatons of power. For comparison, the Krakatoa volcano explosion in 1883 equaled around 200 megatons. Far less than our all-nuke explosion, but equal to about 4 Tsar Bombas. But the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora was thought to be 10 times more powerful than Krakatoa, which would put it at about 2 gigatons, roughly half our nuclear apocalypse. Now, while both of those eruptions did have impacts on the climate, the year after Tambora was famously known as the year without a summer because of all the ash, neither of them led to any drastic extinction events. For that, we can look at the mother of all extinction events, the Chicxulub meteor impact, which has been estimated to have had 100 million megatons of explosive power, or about 100,000 gigatons. So, slightly bigger. But the point is, would we destroy the world? Not really, but we'd definitely destroy the world as we know it. Sure, some parts of the world would still be habitable, some people would survive, but it wouldn't be pretty. Radioactive fallout really would be the biggest issue the world would have to contend with. It would have serious health and environmental effects. People would breathe it in, leading to high risk of cancer. It would fall on crops, leading to food shortages. All the ash and dust in the air would have a cooling effect on the planet, the so-called nuclear winter, although there are debates about how long that would last. In fact, it's thought that famine itself within 2 years of nuclear war would kill 10 times more people than the bombs. So it's still way more than we would ever need to win any kind of war. So why do we have all these nuclear weapons? Throughout history, there's been this sort of repeating pattern of people inventing increasingly more horrifying weapons with the goal of ending war. I mean, the Gatling gun is a prime example. Richard Gatling thought his invention would help end conflicts because people would see how horrific the carnage was after using his gun. Alfred Nobel invented TNT for the same purpose and then went on to create the Nobel Prize. There is this thing of pacifists creating increasingly more horrible weapons with the goal of ending war, only to make war worse than ever before. And we built the nuclear bomb for the same reason, to end World War II. This then led to the mutual assured destruction scenario between the US and the Soviet Union, but did the building, testing, and exploding of nuclear bombs actually work? I mean, if you look at the number of deaths in the 20th century and the 21st century so far, we've had our share of wars, but nothing on the scale of World War II. So, to try to put some kind of a positive spin on this, maybe the invention of the nuclear bomb did finally show us that we're capable of completely destroying ourselves, and it turned into a line that we don't want to cross. Or in the famous words of J. Robert Oppenheimer, I guess it worked. Until, it doesn't. But that's it for now. You guys go out there, have an eye-opening rest of the week. Stay safe, and I'll see you next Monday. Love you guys. Take care. I was thinking the other day about how back in the 90s there was a catchphrase that people said. It wasn't a very clever catchphrase, but you seem to hear it all the time. And that catchphrase was, "Come on, it's the 90s.
Ma, it's the 90s.
Come on, Uncle Phil, this is the 90s, man.
Man, it's the 90s. It's hammer time. Come on.
It was usually used to justify doing something that was, out of bounds, or trying to get somebody else to do something that they normally wouldn't do. Let's go to a club. Come on, it's the 90s. Just get in the hot tub naked. Come on, it's the 90s. Just sniff this chloroform. Come on, it's the 90s. It was the only time in my life when simply stating the decade that you're living in was a valid justification for dumb behavior. But the 90s were kind of an amazing time, We had great music, awesome TV shows, and, abject terror. We weren't just closing out a decade or even a century. We were closing out an entire millennium. And everybody was thinking about the future. Computers were now in everybody's homes, the internet was officially a thing, and movies like The Matrix kind of reflected our anxiety about where everything was going. I mean, one of the most popular songs in the 90s was actually a song called "It's the End of the World as We Know It." So maybe we were just primed to find an apocalyptic scenario to panic about. And we found one. An apocalypse that never actually happened. Humans are a weird species. We seem to be constantly looking for new crises to be terrified about. And when we find them, sometimes we dig down and we find solutions to them, and then other times we just stick our head in the sand and hope for the best. And then sometimes we do prevent these crises from happening and then laugh at ourselves for ever worrying about them in the first place, just forgetting completely the Herculean efforts that we went through to keep it from happening. I feel so stupid. I spent all that money fixing a gas leak and my house never blew up. What a waste. Younger viewers might not remember this, but 20 years ago, we encountered a terrifying apocalyptic scenario of biblical proportions. I mean, that's how we acted about it anyway. These days, Y2K is seen almost in the same context as near-death experiences or the dancing plague. It was just like a form of mass hysteria that we all suffered from. But today I want to talk about how Y2K was actually a crisis. It was something that could have caused some massive problems and only didn't cause problems because there were some people that saw it coming and worked really hard to keep it from happening. So what was Y2K exactly, for those who don't remember or weren't old enough to be there for it? It was basically a series of computer bugs that threatened to shut down computer systems around the world, everything from individual computers, but also networks at, nuclear facilities and financial institutions. institutions. It's good, let's go with it. I think that line got hit with Y2K. Anyway, it goes like this. In the early days of computing, storage was a valuable commodity. I mean, we've all seen this picture right here of a 5 megabyte storage unit that required piano movers to move into the facility. Programmers had serious constraints to deal with, and every single character of code was precious. So to save space, they used 2 digits instead of 4 to represent years in the code, so it would use 53 instead of 1953. And yeah, I know that today that sounds trivial, but again, 5 megabytes. And then when records started to become digitized, a lot of people didn't bother to go in and, recode those dates. They left them as the 2-digit dates. For example, the Department of Defense didn't ever go back and redo those dates in their systems. It made sense at the time, but as it turns out, time moves forward, and eventually we were going to get to the year 2000, and when that happened, would the computers know that the time odometer had flipped over to 2000, or would it think that it was the year 1900? So in the 1980s and early 90s, industry experts started to see this potential problem coming forward, and it was going to be a bigger problem sooner than they thought. Like, imagine it's the year, let's say 1996, and you have a credit card that has an expiration date in 01. And you go to use that credit card in a supermarket, and the supermarket computer thinks that it's trying to say 1901, meaning your credit card has been expired for 90-something years. Small problem. And fixing the problem was a challenge because oftentimes corporations just kind of patch old systems instead of creating all new ones. And this is kind of the dirty secret of the IT industry. Have you ever wondered why so many corporations get hit by hackers? It's because they're usually running old legacy systems that have never been upgraded. Or running with outdated features like, security. Speaking of security, not a joke, just a few years ago I was working at a newspaper and I remember the security system was being run on an Apple IIe. I'm not kidding. When you're dealing with a huge company with thousands of moving parts, the whole "if it ain't broke, don't fix it" mantra can be taken to extremes. So yeah, in the 1990s, when the Y2K thing started to become, well known and talked about, many of these corporations were running on 10, 20, 30-year-old computer software programs. And because they were running in such old software programs, a lot of these companies had trouble finding people that could go in and work on them because, everybody else had kind of moved on. Some people actually came out of retirement to go and fix computers for corporations to prevent the Y2K bug. And the more trouble companies had fixing this, the more headlines they seemed to make. And they got louder and more bombastic over time. Next thing you know, people are talking about Y2K being the end of the world. And survivalists got triggered because, of course they did. Gun sales went up. The whole thing. For a while there, you couldn't even walk through a Barnes & Noble without being inundated by Y2K survival guides. There were TV shows about it, VHS tapes that you could rent. One of them actually starred Spock. And I'm pretty sure I just said the most anachronistic sentence ever. And then January 1st came and went, and nothing happened. And a lot of people started to wonder if it was all just a big hoax. Satirist Dave Barry wrote that Y2K received more media hype than global warming and Britney Spears combined. Late night comedians had a field day with it.
Oh, the Y2K bug. Everything with a computer's gonna stop.
So from right here, right now, it's easy to look back at the 90s and the Y2K panic and, make fun of it, make light of it, but we're looking at it with our eyes. We now know that nothing happened. It's kind of like looking back on The Empire Strikes Back and trying to watch it as if you didn't know anything about Darth Vader being Luke's dad. Spoilers. But none of this was true back in the 1950s when IBM's Robert Bremer first pointed this out. He was unusually far-sighted in his approach. He actually figured out a way to do 4-digit years in COBOL back in the 1950s, and he tried to petition the Department of Defense to get caught up on it themselves. Of course, like I said before, they didn't really do that. Others were ahead of the curve as well. A husband and wife writing team, the Murrays, published a book about the coming crisis in 1984 after Mrs. Murray encountered a Y2K bug in a financial program. A programmer from South Africa named Chris Anderson sent an open letter to IBM in the form of a half-page magazine ad published in 1986. His tagline read, "The time bomb in your IBM mainframe system." In 1993, Canadian Peter de Jager became one of the loudest Y2K voices when he wrote a 3-page article, Doomsday 2000, for Computer World. De Jager's been labeled an alarmist for his insistent warnings that he gave. But actually, in reality, he kind of underestimated the problem. He predicted that fixing Y2K would cost somewhere between $50 and $70 billion. The actual amount spent, according to estimates, was between $280 and $600 billion. And with such a huge investment, you would think that everybody would be happy that nothing went wrong. And now there were a few glitches on January 1st, but nobody died, so nobody cared. Obviously, this is a good thing, but de Jager and many of his contemporaries were labeled as alarmist kooks. In fact, he actually said in a Time interview, quote, "I find myself in the peculiar position sometimes of practically wishing that we had failed in order to prove that we were correct." Y2K was a non-disaster, but only because companies and governments and individuals put in a lot of effort to keep it from happening, and they got zero credit for it. As technology forecaster Paul Sappho was quoted as saying, "It's better to be an anonymous success than a public failure." So look, would the world have completely ended if we hadn't done anything about Y2K? Probably not. Would some energy grids have gone down? Would the financial markets have taken a huge hit? The fact is, we have the luxury of not knowing. We saw a crisis coming and we acted on it and we prevented it. And now we can look back and giggle at the people who took it so seriously only because those people took it so seriously. Personally, I would rather be thought of as a fool who acted to prevent a crisis from happening that never actually happened, rather than somebody who just sticks my head in the sand and hopes for the best. But then I've never had a lot of pride, so. But let me put it to you. Were you around during the Y2K scare? Do you have any memories of how people were panicking over it? Or were you one of those many faceless people that did the job of keeping this from happening? I would love to hear your stories in the comments down below. Come on, don't be shy. It's the 90s. Thanks for watching. Please like and share this if you liked it. And if this is your first time here, maybe check out this video because Google thinks you'll like that one, judging off of what you've looked at in the past. Any of the videos down here on the side that they might show you that have my face on it, go check those out. And if you like those, I invite you to subscribe. I come back with videos every Monday and every Thursday. So all right, that's it for now. You guys go out, have an eye-opening rest of the week, and I'll see you on Monday. Love you guys. Take care. Do you mind? Is that doing anything for you? It's annoying me. You don't get an ASMR from it? I don't think that's how it works. You? ASMR? Yeah, but not, I mean... Oh, really? You get them? What does it? I mean, it's not, I don't know, it's random. Is it whispering? No. Guys. I'm just saying I've experienced it, okay? That's it. Can we leave it at that, please? Please? Thank you. Oh. Okay, I knew it. Seriously? Oh, no, come on. Jeez, that's not what... Dude. Unreal. I'm not one to kink shame, but damn, dude. I told you something went wrong with him. I know, right? You're the one that farted. It's been called the tingles, whisper porn, even brain orgasms. And much like regular orgasms, some people just can't have them. At least that's what I've been told by some girlfriends. It's called ASMR, and if you've never heard of it, welcome to the internet. It's a sensation that people have probably been experiencing for thousands of years, but it was only after the internet came along that millions of people were able to kind of like look at each other and be like, oh, you too? ASMR stands for Autonomous Sensory Meridian Response, and it was coined by a woman named Jennifer Allen in 2010. She was part of a Reddit thread that was trying to get to the bottom of this whole phenomenon, and yeah, the name just kind of stuck. It was a more clinical sounding name that was designed to make it easier to talk about, and also to make researchers take it more seriously. Not to mention to negate associations with, sexual fetishism. Because it's actually not a sexual thing, even though they do call it whisper porn and brain orgasms and, every search result you get. Dr. Craig Richard from Shenandoah University in Virginia is an ASMR expert and created an online resource called ASMR University. He's also the author of the book Brain Tingles, where he describes ASMR as, quote, a deeply relaxing feeling often accompanied by light and pleasurable brain tingles. It's often stimulated during moments of positive personal attention from a kind or caring person whispering, speaking, acting, and moving in a gentle way. It may be likely that about 10 to 20% of the global population is able to experience ASMR. Up until 2010, ASMR was sometimes called the unnamed feeling, or weird head sensation, and attention-induced euphoria. It was also called head tingles, head orgasm, and braingasm. A person going by the screen name Whispering Life uploaded the first intentional ASMR video to YouTube in 2009. The title was Whisper 1 Hello, and it consists of just a black screen and a lo-fi produced whispered recording of her talking about making an ASMR video channel specifically for whispering. And since then, ASMR content has just exploded online. When researching this video, we did a Google search and it brought up 244 million videos. So you're watching the 244 million and first video ever made about ASMR. It's even making its way into mainstream commercials. And films, even. Hershey's actually released about a 90-minute online video called Reese the Movie, an ASMR Experience in 2019. Yeah, they basically brought in 5 popular ASMR creators to just sit around a table in an orange room and take turns whispering about the candy, along with, crinkling its wrappers and eating the peanut butter cups. Michelob Ultra actually released a commercial during the 2019 Super Bowl that had Zoe Kravitz in it, kind of whispering into a microphone and tapping her fingernails. Well, you've seen it. Other brands using ASMR include IKEA, Kentucky Fried Chicken, Lynx, McDonald's, Renault, and Ritz Crackers. So yeah, it's definitely become a whole thing, but how does this work exactly? Like what happens physiologically when you get triggered into an ASMR experience? Okay, so first of all, it is not experienced by everyone, but for those who do experience ASMR, it usually starts in childhood. Like you might feel tingles in your head when you were checked for lice or when fingers are running through your hair. Or maybe you felt tingles when somebody runs their finger up your back. Which actually doesn't sound that weird to me. I mean, doesn't everybody get that? Other consistent triggers that a lot of people report are close personal attention, crisp sounds, delicate hand movements, soft speaking, soft touching, and whispering. Or any combination of those things. But actually studying ASMR does present some challenges. It's pretty hard for some people to actually, kind of have this ASMR experience when they're in a clinical setting, for obvious reasons. And it's also kind of hard to determine whether or not people are having true ASMR experiences. But regardless, there have been a lot of studies that have been done over the years trying to get to the bottom of exactly what causes these things and what kind of commonalities there are in the personalities of people who experience them. Now, one obvious way to see what's going on in the brain would be to put people in an fMRI machine and see if they can have an ASMR experience in there. And that's exactly what Dr. Richard did with 10 participants in 2018. And what they found was that they did see a significant activation in areas associated with reward and emotional arousal. And they said that this had similarities to patterns that are observed in what's called musical frisson, or also musical chills because of the chills down the spine sensation that some people get when listening to certain types of music. As Dr. Richard told National Geographic in March 2022, quote, the study showed that specific areas of the brain are active when somebody is experiencing ASMR. Some of these regions highlight the likely involvement of dopamine and oxytocin. Oxytocin is often called the love hormone or the cuddle hormone. It's something that we kind of release when we're feeling close to other people. And apparently it turns out that behaviors that trigger oxytocin release are very similar to the ones that trigger ASMR. Oxytocin is also known for kind of creating feelings of relaxation and comfort, which are similar to ASMR feelings. Another study in 2017 focused on the default mode network of the brain. This gets a little bit in the weeds, but the default mode network is basically made up of several modules in your brain, and it's on when you're not. Like if you're focusing on a task, something external, then the network is less active. But if you're kind of relaxed and looking inward, thinking, being introspective, that's when it becomes more active. And in this study, they measured the DMN activity of 11 people who could experience ASMR, and then 11 people who can't as a control group. And they found that there was less functional connectivity in people who experience ASMR. In other words, all those different modules that make up the DMN had weaker connections in the ASMR group, possibly making it easier for certain sensory stimuli to kind of short it out. But they did find higher connectivity in certain parts of the brain that manage sort of executive control and then visual resting state networks. So to put all that together into some sexy science speak, the researchers suggest that it's possible that, quote, ASMR reflects a reduced ability to inhibit sensory emotional experiences that are suppressed in most individuals. In other words, it might be something that we all feel, but most of our brains kind of suppress that. The researchers in this study made sure to point out that this doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with people who experience ASMR. It's not like a mental disorder or anything. In fact, it might actually be helpful as a tool to cope with depression or stress. Speaking of coping, 2 studies published in PLOS One in 2018 looked into the physiological benefits of the ASMR experience, especially when watching the videos. One of these studies showed reduced heart rates and increased skin conductance levels and said that it could be, quote, a reliable and physiologically rooted experience that may have therapeutic benefits for mental and physical health. And the researchers were specifically adamant to note that both studies showed that ASMR is not associated with sexual arousal. As the researchers wrote, quote, this misconception may arise from the often interpersonal and intimate nature of some ASMR videos, but our research indicates that sexual arousal is not a reliable outcome of watching ASMR videos. The boobs in the thumbnails are just a bonus, I guess. Then there's a new study published in the Journal of Research and Personality in April 22 that focuses on sensitivity. The study looked at 500 people and showed that people who experience ASMR scored significantly higher on tests involving external hypersensitivity and body perception. But as one of the researchers pointed out, this does have a downside. It says, quote, highly sensitive people may be able to experience intensely pleasurable feelings like ASMR, but this high sensitivity also has its downsides. For example, the noise of a pen clicking or someone chewing gum could set off a negative reaction, which others would simply ignore. There is actually a term for what could maybe be considered the opposite of ASMR, which is misophonia. This is where you experience discomfort or disgust at certain sounds. Another study from February of 2022, there's a lot of studies that seem to be coming out this year for some reason, but anyway, it suggests that ASMR experiencers may actually have more neurotic behaviors and have more baseline anxiety than non-experiencers. This suggests they may be more prone to experiencing negative emotional states as well. The good news that they say here is that it suggests that the ASMR experience can actually help mitigate that. And one last study worth mentioning is published in Frontiers of Psychology in 2017. This one focused on personality traits. They studied 290 ASMR experiencers along with 290 controls, and they found that the ASMR group demonstrated higher scores on openness to experience and neuroticism, but lower levels of conscientiousness, extroversion, and agreeableness when compared to the controls. In other words, introverts may be more likely to be ASMR experiencers. They said, quote, it may be that inward-looking people are more likely to experience ASMR symptoms than more sociable, outward-looking people. Alternatively, the ASMR symptoms may lead people to be less sociable and more introspective. A little bit of a chicken and the egg thing going on there, but I can definitely see how people who might be hypersensitive to external stimuli might prefer to be in more quiet and relaxed settings. So that's a lot of studies. What are we supposed to make of all this? Well, first of all, ASMR is non-sexual. Really. And some people who experience it may have more anxiety than others, may be more introverted than others, but the experience is a beneficial one for them to have. Also, another theory is that ASMR could be triggering memories from infancy. In fact, Dr. Richard thinks that the quality underneath almost all the ASMR videos is something of a tranquil womb-like intimacy. He believes that sounds like towel folding and whispering are more about like triggering the experience of being loved. Like when the study participants that he worked with were asked how they most prefer to experience ASMR, like outside of videos, they usually rank things like light touches with their eyes closed. Sound triggers would rank second, visual ones below that. And he points out that interestingly, that's how our senses develop over time when we're infants. You know, when you're born, your eyes aren't fully working yet, you don't really have that sensation just yet. You're kind of, most of your information about the world is gained through touch. And parents often, you know, coddle and stroke their newborns to kind of connect with them. So ASMR could just be an experience of reliving your newborn time. Or as Dr. Richard told Smithsonian Magazine in 2017, quote, the reason people can get tingles and feel relaxed and comforted listening to Maria gentle whispering is because she's acting very much the way a parent would care for you, with caring glances, gentle speech, and soothing hand movements. This is kind of just classic pattern recognition, you know? Our brains recognize the pattern of somebody who cares and that comforts us, and it activates that oxytocin that makes us feel good. So maybe that's what it's all about when it all comes down to it, you know? Just feeling loved and cared for. After all the studies, all the theories, all the debates around it, maybe it's just the really deep down universal human need to feel loved. So if you're into ASMR content and somebody tries to give you crap for it, you've got the perfect comeback.
I just want to be loved. Is that so wrong?
So sound off in the comments. Do you experience ASMR? And if so, what's your trigger? What sets it off? What does it for you? Or hey, misophonia. Is there any sound that you just can't stand? My little weird thing is that I can't stand the sound of when people wear like thong sandals, and as they walk, the sandal kind of slaps against the bottom of their feet. I don't know why. I can't stand it. It just makes me, ugh. But either way, if you enjoy a good brain tingle, I say go for it. You know what? Life is hard. Times are tough. Self-care is important. All right, guys, that's it for now. You guys go out there, have an eye-opening rest of the week. Stay safe, and I'll see you next Monday. Love you guys. Take care. Or should I say, love you guys. Take care. All right, guys, that's all of them. That's a good 2.5 hours or so of old videos. I hope you enjoyed that. Please check the links down below for the book and the movie. Hope you get a chance to look at both of those. And this is the end of 2025. And I just want to say thanks. It's been a weird year. I've been working on a lot of big projects outside of YouTube that are now kind of gone out. And my next big thing for the next year, honestly, is just to focus back on the channel and get things back to the cadence you guys are used to. So you'll be seeing a lot more new videos in 2026, and I look forward to bringing them to you. But like always, I just appreciate you guys so much. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you enjoy what's coming. And I hope you have a wonderful holiday and new year and a great start to 2026. That's it for now. You guys go out there, have an eye-opening rest of the year, and I'll see you next time. Love you guys. Take care.